May 11, 1889, began with a deceptively calm sunrise over the Pinaleño Mountains, the light catching the dust motes in the paymaster's office at Fort Grant, where a fortune in gold and silver coin sat waiting to be weighed, bagged, and transported into a zone of imminent violence. Major Joseph W. Wham stood before the heavy iron safe, the metal cool to the touch against the warming morning air, fully aware that the $28,345.10 resting inside represented the sole lifeline for the troops stationed at the remote outpost of Fort Thomas. The major did not view the money as wealth in the abstract sense, but rather as a heavy physical burden of logistical obligation that required precise handling and absolute security. He turned the tumblers of the combination lock with a practiced rhythm, the mechanical clicks the only sound in the room other than the scratching of a pen across a ledger by his clerk, William Gibbon. Gibbon sat at a heavy oak desk nearby, the surface cluttered with requisition forms, pay rosters, and transport manifests that required triple verification before the convoy could even consider moving toward the stables. The clerk dipped his steel nib into the inkwell, recording the date and the specific breakdown of the funds. The inventory was substantial, consisting largely of gold, double eagles and eagles, their density making the canvas sacks sag aggressively against the wooden floorboards when removed from the safe. Alongside the gold sat a significant quantity of silver dollars, the sheer mass of the silver adding a cumbersome weight that would strain the axles of the Army ambulance designated for the transport. Wham reached into the safe and began the physical labor of transferring the specie. He gripped the neck of a canvas sack, the rough fabric biting into his palm, and heaved it onto the scale to verify the weight against the Treasury stamp. The scale balanced perfectly, the brass counterweights leveling out against the heavy sack of gold coin. Wham nodded to Gibbon, who made a check mark in the ledger. This process repeated for every individual sack. There was no room for error in the accounting. The United States Army demanded that every cent be accounted for upon departure and upon arrival. The gold coins clinked with a dull, heavy thud as the bags were placed onto a waiting handcart. The silver made a sharper, more resonant sound, the coins shifting against one another like gravel. Wham paused to wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead, not from heat, as the room was still relatively temperate, but from the exertion of lifting hundreds of pounds of metal. He checked the straps on each bag, ensuring the wax seals were unbroken and the drawstrings were knotted tightly enough to prevent any coin from slipping out during the jarring ride over the rough Arizona roads. Once the funds were verified, Wham and Gibbon maneuvered the handcart out of the office and toward the waiting Army ambulance parked in the dusty courtyard. The vehicle was a standard-issue Dougherty wagon designed with heavy springs to mitigate the punishment of the frontier terrain. But even these reinforced suspensions would be tested by the payload. The wagon was painted a dull olive drab, the wood dried and cracked in places from the relentless sun of the territory. The wheels were tall, rimmed with iron that showed the scars of impacts against granite and basalt rocks from previous journeys. Wham walked around the vehicle, inspecting the spokes of the rear left wheel. He ran his hand along the wood, feeling for any splintering or weakness that might give way under the load. A broken wheel on the road to Fort Thomas would leave them stationary targets in a landscape known for hostility. The major knelt in the dirt to examine the undercarriage. He checked the grease on the axles, noting that the black lubricant was fresh and sufficient to keep the hubs turning smoothly for the 40-plus miles they needed to cover. The smell of the grease mixed with the scent of dry sagebrush and horse manure that permeated the fort. He stood up and tested the tailgate, rattling the iron chains to ensure they were securely fastened to the sideboards. The ambulance had a canvas cover stretched over wooden boughs, providing shade for the interior but offering zero ballistic protection against incoming fire. Wham knew that the canvas would do nothing to stop a .45 caliber slug, but the priority was protecting the money from the elements, not the passengers from combat. That was the job of the escort. Gibbon began lifting the sacks from the handcart into the bed of the wagon. He placed them directly over the rear axle to distribute the weight evenly, stacking them inside a reinforced wooden strongbox bolted to the floor of the ambulance. This strongbox was the final layer of passive defense. It was constructed of thick oak planks bound with iron straps, featuring a heavy padlock hasp that was currently open waiting to receive the treasury sacks. Wham assisted Gibbon, the two men working in silence as they transferred the gold. The clatter of the bags hitting the bottom of the box echoed slightly in the empty wagon. With the last bag of silver deposited, the combined weight pressed the ambulance springs down several inches, the vehicle settling with a groan of wood and metal. Wham took a heavy iron padlock from his pocket. He inserted the key, turned it to ensure the mechanism was free of grit, and then snapped the shackle through the hasp of the strongbox. He pulled on the lock 3 times hard, verifying that it had engaged completely. The key went back into his vest pocket, secured on a chain. The money was now technically in transit. The responsibility for its safety had shifted from the stationary vault of the fort to the mobile vulnerability of the wagon. Wham climbed into the driver's seat to test the brake lever. He pushed long iron handle forward, feeling the resistance as the brake blocks clamped against the rear tires. The tension was correct. The brakes would hold on the steep grades of the canyon roads they would soon traverse. The mules designated for the ambulance were being led out of the corral by the stable hands. These were not the sleek horses of the cavalry, but distinctively sturdy army mules, bred for endurance and the ability to haul heavy loads over broken ground. There were 4 of them, a team specifically chosen for their steady temperament. Wham watched as the handlers backed the animals into position. The mules snorted and stamped, kicking up small clouds of dust. The lead pair was a dark brown, while the wheelers, the pair closest to the wagon, were a lighter shade of dun. The handlers lifted the heavy leather harnesses, draping them over the mules' backs. The leather was worn smooth from use, the brass fittings tarnished but functional. Wham descended from the wagon seat to inspect the hitching process personally. He checked the traces, the thick leather straps that connected the collar of the mule to the singletree of the wagon. A snapped trace on an uphill climb could send the wagon rolling backward or cause it to jackknife. He pulled on the leather, looking for dry rot or fraying stitching. The equipment was solid. He moved to the collars, running his fingers between the leather and the mule's shoulder to ensure there were no burrs or debris that would cause a sore. A mule in pain was a mule that would balk, and Wham could not afford a balking animal in the middle of a wash. The animals smelled of sweat and grain, their ears twitching as the flies began to emerge with the rising sun. Gibbon stood by the rear of the wagon holding a clipboard. He was reviewing the route itinerary one final time. The path to Fort Thomas required them to travel north, traversing the Gila Valley and crossing the treacherous expanse of Cottonwood Wash. The road was not a maintained highway, but a rutted track carved into the hardpack and rock by years of military and civilian traffic. It wound through blind curves, dipped into dry creek beds, and skirted the edges of steep ridges. Gibbon knew the terrain was favorable to ambushers, providing ample cover for anyone wishing to remain unseen while observing the road. He folded the itinerary and placed it in his tunic pocket, buttoning the flap securely. The major walked to the front of the team and looked the lead mule in the eye. The animal blinked slowly, indifferent to the significance of the cargo it was about to haul. Wham patted the animal's neck, a pragmatic gesture to gauge the animal's mood rather than one of affection. The mule remained calm. Wham signaled to the stable sergeant that the team was approved. The handlers buckled the final straps of the bridles and hooked the reins to the bits. The long leather driving lines were run back through the terrets on the harness saddles to the driver's seat. Wham climbed back up, Taking the reins in his gloved hands, he felt the weight of the team through the leather lines, a direct connection to the motive power that would carry the payroll. The sun had now cleared the horizon completely, casting long, sharp shadows across the parade ground. The temperature began to climb steadily. It would be a hot day, dry and parched, typical for May in the Arizona territory. The air was still, with no breeze to stir the dust. Wham checked his pocket watch. It was time. He looked over at Gibbon, who climbed up to sit beside him on the bench seat. The clerk placed the payroll ledgers between his knees, the leather satchel pinned against the floorboards. Wham carried a canteen in a sling at his hip, the strap loosened for easier access. They were unarmed, but they were drivers and administrators, not the primary defense. Behind the ambulance, a second vehicle was being prepared, the escort wagon that would carry the forage, rations, and the personal kits of the soldiers. Wham glanced back to ensure the second team was being hitched with the same care. The logistical tail was just as important as the head. If the escort wagon failed, the ambulance would be forced to stop or proceed alone, neither of which was an acceptable option. The escort wagon was an open-topped utility wagon, lighter than the ambulance but heavily laden with crates of hardtack, sacks of oats for the mules, and canteens of water. The wheels of the escort wagon were slightly narrower, cutting deeper into the sand. Wham adjusted his hat, pulling the brim lower to shield his eyes from the glare. He felt the familiar tension in his stomach that always preceded a transport mission. It was a cold, hard knot of anticipation. He looked out at the open gate of Fort Grant. Beyond the wooden structures and the orderly rows of tents lay the wilderness, a vast expanse of scrub brush, cactus, and rock that belonged to no one and everyone. The road leading out was empty, a ribbon of pale dirt stretching toward the mountains. Wham tightened his grip on the reins. He waited for the signal that the escort detail was formed and ready to move. The money in the box behind him was a dead weight, an inert object that dictated the lives and actions of every man involved in the operation. The major took a moment to mentally review the packing of the strongbox. He visualized the interior, the way the bags were stacked. If they hit a significant bump, the bags might shift. He hoped the tight packing would prevent too much movement. The shifting of weight in a turn could destabilize the high center of gravity of the ambulance. He had driven these roads enough to know where the worst ruts were located. He planned to take the section near Cedar Springs slowly. The washouts there were notorious for breaking axles. He mapped the drive in his head mile by mile, anticipating the drag of the sand and the rattle of the stones. Gibbon shifted on the seat, checking the lashings on the load. He tugged the strap slightly, just enough to feel it hold under tension, then let it settle. The leather creak was distinct. Wham noted the action but said nothing. The readiness of the weapons was a standard precaution. The Fort Grant garrison was active, and the Apache conflicts, while officially waning, had left a residue of danger in the territory. Renegades and desperate men still roamed the high country. But today, the threat Wham was most concerned with was not the indigenous resistance, but the opportunistic greed of highwaymen who might have gotten wind of the payroll schedule. The internal mechanism of the fort began to churn around them. Soldiers on fatigue duty walked past with shovels and brooms, glancing at the paymaster's wagon with knowing looks. Everyone knew what the ambulance contained. The arrival of the pay was the most significant event in the monthly calendar of a soldier. It meant settling debts at the sutler's store, buying whiskey, and gambling. The visibility of the mission was its greatest weakness. It was impossible to move $28,345.10 in secret when the entire economy of the region depended on its arrival. Wham accepted this lack of secrecy as an operational hazard. He looked down at his boots resting on the slanted floorboard. They were polished, the leather stiff. He flexed his toes, ensuring the circulation was good. He would be sitting for hours, managing the team, his legs bracing against the motion of the wagon. Driving a 4-mule team was physically demanding work. It required constant adjustments of the reins to keep the animals pulling in unison. If one mule lagged, the entire team suffered. Wham was an experienced driver, confident in his ability to manage the animals, provided the road remained passable and the environment remained passive. The wooden structures of Fort Grant stood stark and rigid against the landscape. The whitewashed adobe and timber buildings were symbols of order imposed on a chaotic land. Wham respected the order. He was a man of regulations and procedures. The payroll transport was a procedure governed by specific Army regulations regarding the security of public funds. He had followed every regulation to the letter. The funds were counted, verified, boxed, locked, and loaded. The vehicle was inspected. The route was planned. He had done his part. The variable now was the external world. Gibbon pulled a canteen from beneath the seat and took a sip of water. He offered it to Wham, who declined with a shake of his head. Wham preferred to travel dry, avoiding the need for stops. Stops were dangerous. A moving target was harder to hit and harder to ambush. A stationary wagon was a tactical liability. His goal was to maintain a steady pace of 4 to 5 miles per hour, keeping the mules at a brisk walk or a slow trot on the flat sections. He calculated the arrival time at Fort Thomas based on this pace. If they left within the hour, they would arrive before nightfall, provided there were no delays. The paymaster glanced at the sun again. It was rising higher, the angle of the light shifting. The shadows shortened. The day was advancing. He felt a surge of impatience. He wanted to be moving. The waiting was always the worst part. Sitting in the open carriage, exposed with a fortune behind his back, made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. He watched the stable sergeant signal the completion of the hitching for the escort wagon. The second team was ready. The drivers were in place. The logistical component of the convoy was assembled. Wham took a deep breath, inhaling the dry air. He could taste the dust. It was a gritty, alkaline taste that defined the territory. He wrapped the reins around his hands, taking up the slack. The leather bit into his gloves. He felt the mouths of the mules, the slight resistance as they chewed on the bits. They were ready to go. They sensed the tension, their ears swiveling back toward the driver. Wham sat straight, his spine against the backrest. He was the commander of this specific vessel, the guardian of the treasury. He was prepared to drive the money through the gauntlet of the Arizona wilderness. The gold in the box was silent, heavy, and indifferent to the men who would bleed for it. While Major Wham finalized the loading of the currency, the men of the escort detail were engaged in the disciplined rituals of preparation on the opposite side of the parade ground. Sergeant Benjamin Brown of the 24th Infantry stood at the center of the activity, a figure of rigid authority amidst the shifting dust and movement. He was a veteran soldier, his uniform bearing the chevrons of his rank stitched precisely onto the dark blue wool of his sleeves. The heat of the morning was already building, baking the moisture out of the air, yet Brown wore his tunic fully buttoned to the collar, strictly adhering to regulations. He watched as the privates of the 24th Infantry and the 10th Cavalry assembled their kits, his eyes scanning for any deviation from the standard loadout. The men were Buffalo Soldiers, African-American regulars who had spent years patrolling the hard territories of the West, and they moved with an economy of motion born from long experience in the field. Corporal Isaiah Mays of the 10th Cavalry walked his horse toward the assembly point. The animal was a tall bay, its coat brushed to a shine that was already beginning to dull under the settling dust. Mays checked the girth strap, pulling it tight against the horse's belly. The animal exhaled, expanding its ribcage against the pressure, but Mays held the strap firm and buckled it into the second hole. He ran his hand down the horse's left foreleg, checking the tendons for heat or swelling. The terrain they would cover that day was unforgiving, composed of loose shale and hard granite that could turn a minor stumble into a lame animal. Mays found the leg cool and solid. He moved to the saddlebags, ensuring they were evenly weighted. Inside, he carried extra ammunition, a crucial resource for the escort mission. The infantrymen were not mounted. They would be riding in the escort wagon or walking alongside the ambulance on the steeper grades. Private James Young sat on a wooden crate cleaning his Springfield rifle. He held the weapon across his lap, a Model 1884 with the Buffington rear sight. Young dipped a patch of cotton flannel into a tin of oil and ran it through the bore with a brass cleaning rod. The patch came out gray with carbon residue. He replaced it with a clean one and repeated the process until the cotton emerged white. The mechanism of the trapdoor breech was simple but unforgiving of neglect. Young opened the breech block, the hinged metal flipping up and forward to reveal the chamber. He used a small brush to sweep out grains of sand that had accumulated near the extractor. A single grain of sand in the wrong place could prevent the breech from locking, rendering the rifle useless after the first shot. Sergeant Brown approached Young, looking down at the disassembled weapon. He did not speak immediately, merely observing the private's hands. Young finished his cleaning, snapped the breech block shut, and wiped down the exterior metal with an oily rag. The blued steel gleamed in the sunlight. Brown nodded once, a silent affirmation of the weapon's readiness, and moved to the next man. The sergeant carried his own revolver, a Colt single-action Army, on his hip. He drew the weapon, checking the cylinder rotation. The clicks were crisp. He verified that 5 chambers were loaded with .45 caliber cartridges, leaving the chamber under the hammer empty for safety. He returned the pistol to its holster and fastened the leather flap. Private Squire Williams was busy organizing the rations for the detail. He stacked tins of corned beef and hardtack into a wooden box that would be loaded onto the escort wagon. The tins were heavy, their labels peeling slightly in the dry air. Williams counted them out loud, 1, 2, 3, ensuring there was enough food for 2 days, providing a margin of error should the return trip be delayed. Beside the food, he placed a crate of ammunition. This was the reserve supply, consisting of 500 rounds of .45-70 government cartridges packed in cardboard cartons. The lead bullets were heavy, possessing a blunt, rounded nose designed to smash through bone and muscle. Williams lifted the crate, the weight straining his forearms, and carried it to the rear of the escort wagon where the driver, a civilian employee, was waiting to stow it. The escort detail consisted of 11 soldiers in total, 8 from the 24th Infantry and 2 from the 10th Cavalry plus the sergeant. This mixed unit was a common sight on the frontier, where manpower shortages often necessitated blending squads from different regiments. Despite the difference in unit designation, infantry versus cavalry, the men knew each other well. They shared the same barracks, the same food, and the same isolation at the remote outpost. Private George Arrington stood by the wheel of the wagon, adjusting his cartridge belt. The woven loops of the belt were full, each holding a single brass cartridge. The weight of the ammunition pulled at his waist, a constant reminder of the potential for violence. He counted the rounds by touch, running his thumb over the flat lead noses. 40 rounds in the belt. He had another 20 in his pockets. Corporal Mays finished saddling his horse and led the animal over to where Sergeant Brown was standing. The cavalryman stood taller in his riding boots. He adjusted his hat, tilting the brim to shield his eyes. The 2 non-commissioned officers conferred in low tones, discussing the marching order. Mays would ride point, scouting ahead of the ambulance to check for obstacles or sign of ambush. Private checking the rear would be the responsibility of the infantrymen in the wagon. Brown emphasized the need for vigilance in the canyon sectors. He had received intelligence reports of increased bandit activity in the Gila Valley, though nothing specific enough to cancel the mission. The threat was a general, ambient danger that permeated the territory. Private Hamilton was filling canteens at the water pump. The water was cool as it flowed from the iron spout, splashing over his hands. He filled his own canteen, submerged the cork to swell it for a tight seal, and then filled the canteens of the men who were busy with other tasks. Hydration was a critical logistical concern. The route to Fort Thomas crossed dry washes where water was scarce. A soldier suffering from heat exhaustion was a liability to the unit. Hamilton slung 5 canteens over his shoulder, the canvas covers dripping wet, and walked back to the group. He handed them out, each man taking his own and clipping it to his belt or saddle. The wet canvas would cool the water through evaporation as they traveled. The bugler sounded a call from the headquarters building, the brass notes cutting through the morning noise. It was not a call for them, but it marked the passage of time. Sergeant Brown checked his pocket watch. They were scheduled to move in 10 minutes. He ordered the men to fall in for a final inspection. The soldiers formed a single line, their boots shuffling in the dirt until they were evenly spaced. They stood at attention, rifles grounded, their posture straightening as Brown walked down the line. He inspected their uniforms, looking for loose buttons or torn fabric. He checked their boots, ensuring the laces were tied securely and tucked in to prevent snagging. Brown stopped in front of Private Julius Burge. He reached out and tugged on the soldier's cartridge belt. It was loose. Brown tightened it himself, pulling the canvas strap until it sat firmly against the man's hips. A loose belt could rotate during a run or a fall, dumping ammunition or hindering movement. Burge stared straight ahead, accepting the correction without flinching. Brown moved on. He checked the sight leaf on Private Thornton's rifle. The sliding ladder was set to 0 yards. Brown nodded. There was no need for long-range settings inside the fort. They would adjust their sights only if they engaged targets at distance. The mules for the escort wagon were hitched. These animals were similar to the ones pulling the paymaster's ambulance, tough, obstinate, and strong. The driver of the escort wagon climbed up to his seat. He was a private from the infantry detailed to drive because of his experience with stock. He gathered the reins, feeling the tension of the team. The wagon was loaded with the men's personal kits, the rations, the reserve ammunition, and the bedding rolls. It was a heavy load, but the team was fresh. The driver waited for the signal from Sergeant Brown. Major Wham's ambulance rolled into view, moving slowly from the paymaster's office. The vehicle creaked as it turned, the wheels crunching over the gravel. Wham sat high on the box, the reins in his hands. Clerk Gibbon sat beside him. As the ambulance approached the escort detail, Sergeant Brown called the squad to present arms. The soldiers snapped their rifles up in a crisp salute to the officer and the payload. Wham returned the salute with a touch of his gloved hand to his hat brim. He brought the ambulance to a halt. Brown walked over to the major's side of the wagon. He reported that the escort was formed and ready for duty. Wham acknowledged the report. He instructed Brown to take his position. The plan was for Corporal Mays and Private Benjamin Burge, who was mounted, to ride in advance of the ambulance. The ambulance would follow. The escort wagon would bring up the rear, carrying the bulk of the infantry squad. However, in the event of trouble, the infantry were to dismount immediately and form a skirmish line. Brown understood. He walked back to his men and issued the orders. The infantrymen climbed into the back of the escort wagon. There were no seats. They sat on the crates and the bedding rolls facing outward. This position allowed them to watch the terrain on both sides of the road. They held their rifles between their knees, muzzles pointing up. The space was cramped. Shoulders bumped against shoulders. The smell of wool, gun oil, and unwashed bodies was confined within the wagon bed. Private Arrington adjusted his position to avoid a sharp corner of an ammunition crate digging into his thigh. He rested his arm on the side of the wagon, looking out at the familiar buildings of the fort. Corporal Mays mounted his horse. The animal danced sideways for a step, eager to move before Mays brought it under control with a firm hand on the reins. He trotted to the front of the column, taking his place 20 yards ahead of the major's ambulance. The other mounted soldier joined him. They were the eyes of the convoy. If there was a boulder on the road or a cut wire, they would see it first. Mays checked his carbine, a shorter version of the infantry rifle designed for use on horseback. It sat in a leather scabbard by his right knee. The stock was worn smooth from friction against the saddle leather. Sergeant Brown climbed onto the seat of the escort wagon, sitting beside the driver. This gave him a vantage point to oversee the entire column. He could see the major's back ahead of him and the two cavalrymen further up. He checked the road behind them one last time. It was clear. He signaled to the major that the rear element was ready. Wham released the brake on the ambulance. The chain rattled as the tension released. He clucked to the mules, snapping the reins lightly. The team leaned into the collars and the heavy ambulance began to roll forward. The escort wagon followed suit. The wheels turned, grinding into the dirt. The convoy moved at a walk, maintaining a steady spacing. They passed the guardhouse at the main gate. The sentry on duty, a private from a different company, watched them go. He stood at parade rest, his rifle butt on the ground. There was no exchange of words, just a mutual recognition of the duty. The convoy passed under the wooden arch of the gate and crossed the threshold from the federal jurisdiction of the fort into the public territory of Arizona. As they left the immediate vicinity of the buildings, the environment changed. The shade of the structures disappeared, replaced by the full, unfiltered glare of the sun. The road stretched out, a pale scar cutting through the scrub. The dust kicked up by the lead animals began to drift back, coating the men in the wagons. Private Young pulled a bandana from his pocket and tied it around his neck, preparing to pull it up over his nose if the dust became too thick. The air grew hotter as they moved away from the irrigated grounds of the post. The sound of the convoy was a rhythmic clatter. The iron tires struck rocks with a sharp metallic ring. The harness leather creaked constantly. The mules snorted. The soldiers in the back of the wagon settled into the journey. They stopped talking. Conversation required effort and inhaled dust. They retreated into their own thoughts, watching the landscape slide by. The cactus and mesquite were monotonous, a blur of greens and browns. They scanned the horizon out of habit, looking for movement that didn't belong. A hawk circled high above, riding a thermal current. A jackrabbit bolted from a bush, racing away in a zigzag pattern. Sergeant Brown kept his eyes on the road ahead. He watched the spacing between the escort wagon and the ambulance. He wanted to stay close enough to provide immediate support, but far enough back to avoid a collision if the major stopped suddenly. He maintained a gap of approximately 15 yards. He watched the way the ambulance rocked on its springs. It was heavy. He knew exactly what was inside. The knowledge of the money added a psychological weight to the mission. They were not just transporting supplies, they were transporting a target. Corporal Mays, up at the point, rode with a loose rein, allowing his horse to pick its way through the rougher patches of the track. He constantly swept his gaze from left to right, checking the base of the bushes and the tops of the small rises. He looked for fresh tracks crossing the road. He looked for birds flushing unexpectedly. He was reading the environment for signs of disturbance. The road was quiet. The only tracks were old, the ruts hardened by the sun. The convoy began to descend a shallow grade, the mules holding back the weight of the wagons. The brakes screeched as the drivers applied pressure to control the speed. The noise was loud, echoing off the surrounding hills. It was a sound that announced their presence for miles. Brown winced at the noise. He preferred silence, but silence was impossible with heavy wagons. They were a noisy, visible parade moving through a wilderness that offered 1,000 places to hide. Private Hamilton shifted his rifle, the metal barrel growing warm in the sun. He wiped his sweaty palm on his trousers before gripping the stock again. The heat was becoming oppressive. He took a sip from his canteen, the water tasting of canvas and tin. He looked at the man across from him, Private Rogers. Rogers was dozing, his head nodding with the motion of the wagon. Hamilton kicked his boot lightly. Rogers jerked awake, gripping his rifle. Hamilton pointed to the horizon with his chin. "Stay alert." Rogers nodded, rubbing his eyes. The road curved around a large outcrop of rock. The convoy slowed. Mays rode around the blind turn first, his hand hovering near his carbine. He cleared the turn and signaled that it was safe. The ambulance followed, then the escort wagon. The soldiers in the back tensed as they went around the bend, their eyes searching the rocks above. Nothing. Just lizards sunning themselves on the stone. They relaxed slightly as the road straightened out again. They were 5 miles out from the fort now. The safety of the garrison was gone. They were in the open country. The psychological tether to the post was severed. They were a self-contained unit, reliant entirely on their own weapons and discipline. Brown felt this shift in reality. The rules of the fort, the inspections, the salutes, the polish, faded in importance. The rules of the road took over. Keep the weapons clean, keep the eyes open, keep the animals moving. The dust cloud they generated hung in the air behind them, marking their passage. To anyone watching from the high ground of the Pinaleño Mountains, they were a distinct string of dark shapes crawling across the valley floor. The white canvas tops of the wagons stood out against the earth tones of the desert. They were easy to track. Brown knew this. He accepted it. His job was not to hide, but to repel. He touched the handle of his revolver again, a subconscious gesture of readiness. The leather was hot to the touch. The convoy pressed on, the mules finding their rhythm. The soldiers endured the jolting of the wagon, their bodies swaying in unison. The sun climbed higher, shrinking the shadows until they were pools of black directly beneath the wagons. The morning was passing into midday. The heat shimmered off the road ahead, distorting the air. They moved deeper into the territory, mile by mile, closer to the narrow constriction of Cottonwood Wash, where the geography would turn against them. For now, on the open flats, they were the masters of their surroundings, an armed column of United States regulars projecting force into the void. High above the serpentine track of the road that connected Fort Grant to Fort Thomas, the geography of the Gila Valley contorted into a series of jagged ravines and dry creek beds known collectively as Cottonwood Wash. On the morning of May 11th, 1889, while the military convoy was still assembling miles away on the valley floor, a group of 12 men occupied the strategic heights of a specific ridge that dominated the roadway. This was not a chance gathering. The location had been selected with the cold precision of a military engineer. The road here was forced by the terrain to dip sharply into the wash, cross the gravel bed, and then climb a steep, narrow grade cut into the hillside. Any vehicle attempting the ascent would be reduced to a crawl, the animals struggling for traction, the drivers focused entirely on the path immediately ahead. Wilfred Webb stood at the crest of the ridge, looking down at the empty road. The elevation gave him a commanding view of the approach from the south, yet the ridge itself was concealed from the perspective of anyone on the road below by the lip of the canyon wall. Webb was a man who understood the value of terrain. He pointed to a section of the ridge that ran parallel to the road, approximately 40 feet above the track and less than 50 yards horizontally from where the wagon would pass. The angle was steep enough to negate the cover of the wagon's sideboards, but close enough to ensure that a rifle shot would be nearly impossible to miss. He signaled to the men spread out behind him. They were not there to simply hide behind existing scrub brush. They were there to construct a killing floor. The men began the physical labor of fortification. The landscape was littered with loose basalt and granite rocks, varying in size from fist-sized stones to boulders the weight of a man's torso. The outlaws moved with a grim industry, lifting the heavy stones and stacking them along the edge of the ridge. They built a breastwork, a deliberate stone wall designed to absorb incoming fire while providing loopholes for their own rifles. The sound of rock grinding against rock was the only noise in the canyon, a harsh, scraping rhythm that echoed faintly off the opposing walls. Marcus Cunningham lifted a heavy slab of gray rock, his muscles straining under the weight. He placed it carefully atop a base of smaller stones, checking the stability. The wall needed to be solid. If a bullet struck a loose rock, the resulting shrapnel of stone chips could be as lethal as the lead itself. Cunningham wedged a smaller shard of granite into the gap beneath the slab, shimmying it until the structure was immovable. He wiped the dust from his hands onto his trousers and picked up his rifle, testing the firing port he had just created. He lay on his stomach behind the wall, looking through the gap. The view was perfect. The barrel of his Winchester had a clear line of sight to the center of the road. He could sweep the area where the driver would sit and the area where the escort would likely dismount. To his left, two of the Smith brothers were constructing a similar position. They worked in tandem, one passing stones to the other. They built their section of the wall in a crescent shape, curving the ends back slightly to provide protection from flanking fire should the soldiers manage to maneuver up the slope. The defensive line they were creating was extensive, stretching for nearly 100 feet along the brow of the hill. It transformed the natural ridge into a fortified trench line. This was not the hasty ambush of desperation, it was a prepared siege position. The heat in the wash began to rise as the sun climbed higher, baking the rocks until they were hot to the touch. The air trapped between the canyon walls grew heavy and still. There was no breeze to cool the men as they worked. Sweat dripped from their faces, turning the dust on their skin into streaks of mud. They worked in their shirt sleeves, their vests unbuttoned. Hats were pulled low to shade eyes from the glare. Despite the exertion, there was little conversation. The magnitude of what they were about to do required no discussion. They were planning to engage United States regulars in open combat. This was treason and capital murder, not simple theft. Webb walked the line of the breastworks, inspecting each position. He kicked a stack of stones at the far right flank. It wobbled. He looked at the man responsible, a silent glare that communicated the error. The man immediately dismantled the stack and rebuilt it, choosing flatter stones that interlocked more securely. Webb checked the angles of fire. He wanted to ensure that the entire kill zone was covered by crossfire. He stood where the center of the line would be and looked down. From this vantage point, the soldiers in the open wagon would be visible from the waist up. The mules would be completely exposed. The weaponry brought to the ridge was a collection of high-caliber hardware. There were Winchester repeating rifles, models 1873 and 1876, capable of laying down a rapid volume of fire. There were double-barreled shotguns loaded with buckshot for close-range devastation. There were heavy revolvers, Colts and Remingtons intended for the final stages of the confrontation. The men checked their ammunition supplies. Boxes of cartridges were opened and placed on the ground within easy reach of the firing positions. Some men poured the loose cartridges into their hats, creating a pile of brass and lead that could be grabbed by the handful without looking. One of the men sat with his back against the newly built wall, using a pocket knife to carve an X into the soft lead nose of a .45 caliber bullet. He did this methodically, one cartridge after another. The modification was intended to make the bullet expand more violently upon impact, creating a larger wound channel. He lined the modified cartridges up on a flat rock, the incised lead gleaming dully. It was a vicious detail, a personal touch added to the industrial lethality of the factory ammunition. Webb moved to the edge of the overlook and scanned the northern approach. The road was empty. The silence of the desert was absolute save for the buzzing of insects. He checked his pocket watch. It was past noon. The convoy would be moving slow. The wait was part of the ordeal. Adrenaline surged and faded, leaving a metallic taste in the mouth. The men drank from their canteens sparingly. Water was precious, and they did not know how long the engagement would last or how long they would be on the run afterward. A large lizard scuttled across the top of the stone breastwork, pausing to pump its body up and down before darting into a crevice. The outlaw nearest to it didn't even flinch. His focus was entirely on the geometry of the ambush. He adjusted the rear sight of his rifle, sliding the elevator up a notch. He estimated the range to the road to be 40 yards, but he was shooting downward at a steep angle. He knew he needed to aim low. Gravity would not affect the bullet's drop as much as it would on a flat shot. If he aimed dead on, he might shoot over their heads. He practiced dry firing, snapping the hammer down on an empty chamber, visualizing the sight picture. The group had also brought tools for the final element of the trap, but those would be deployed closer to the moment of arrival. For now, the focus was on the nest. They cleared away loose brush in front of the wall that might obscure their vision, pulling up sagebrush by the roots and tossing it behind the ridge. They wanted a clean field of fire. Every branch that could deflect a bullet was removed. They left the brush further down the slope intact, however, to break up the outline of the ridge from below. Camouflage was maintained. From the road, the ridge would look like just another dusty, rock-strewn hill, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others in the territory. Webb sat down behind the center of the fortification. He took a plug of tobacco from his vest pocket and bit off a corner. He chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on the bend in the road where the convoy would first appear. He ran through the sequence of events in his mind. The lead riders would pass. They would let them pass. The target was the ambulance. The ambulance had to be in the box before the trap was sprung. If they fired too early, the wagon might turn around. If they fired too late, the wagon might clear the kill zone. The timing had to be synchronized. One of the bandits, a younger man, wiped his palms on his trousers repeatedly. His hands were shaking slightly. The older men ignored him. Fear was a chemical reality. It would either vanish when the shooting started, or it would freeze him. There was no way to know until the moment arrived. The older hands checked their weapons again. They opened the loading gates of their Winchesters and topped off the tubular magazines, shoving the cartridges in until the spring resistance was maximum. 15 rounds in the rifle, 6 in the pistol, a belt full of spares. They were ready to start a war. The position offered no shade. The sun beat down on the backs of their necks. The rocks radiated heat upward. The smell of hot dust and gun oil was overpowering. A few of the men draped handkerchiefs over their heads under their hats to protect their necks from sunburn. They squinted against the glare. The waiting stretched on. 1 hour, 2 hours. The shadows began to shift, moving from the west side of the rocks to the east. The light changed, altering the contrast of the landscape. Webb instructed 2 men to move to the far northern end of the ridge. Their job was to watch the back trail. If the soldiers managed to send a runner back toward Fort Grant, these men were to intercept him. They scrambled over the rocks, keeping low to avoid silhouetting themselves against the sky. They took up positions behind a cluster of boulders that offered a view of the road retreating to the south. The ambush was now a 360-degree perimeter of awareness, focused inward on the road. The plan relied heavily on the element of surprise. The soldiers would be tired. They would be hot. They would be lulled by the monotony of the march. The sudden eruption of fire from an elevated, fortified position was designed to induce immediate panic. The outlaws were counting on the mules to panic as well. A team of mules in a frenzy was a weapon in itself, capable of overturning a wagon or dragging it off the road. They hoped the animals would foul the harness, immobilizing the vehicle right in front of the guns. Down in the wash, a dust devil swirled up from the dry creek bed, spinning a column of sand into the air. It danced across the road and dissipated against the canyon wall. The men watched it, their eyes tracking the movement. Anything that moved was a point of interest. The tension was a physical pressure tightening the chest. They checked the actions of their rifles again. Click-clack. The sound was reassuring. It was the sound of mechanical certainty. Webb looked at the position of the sun. It was mid-afternoon. The convoy had to be getting close. He could almost feel the vibration of the wheels in the ground. He signaled for silence, though no one was speaking. He wanted absolute stillness. No movement, no shifting of weight. A glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel or a canteen could give them away. They pulled their rifles back from the loopholes, keeping them in the shadow of the wall. They waited. The construction of the breastworks had taken the better part of the morning. Now the wall stood as a testament to their intent. It was a solid, undeniable structure of war. It changed the legal nature of the event. A robbery was a crime of opportunity. This was a crime of premeditation. The stones were stacked with malice. The firing ports were engineered for murder. The men behind the wall were no longer just cowboys or drifters. They were combatants in a self-declared battle. One of the men took a swig of whiskey from a flask, the amber liquid burning his throat. He offered it to his neighbor, who shook his head. They needed clear heads. The whiskey was returned to a pocket. The man wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He stared at a cactus growing out of the rock face opposite them. He counted the spines on one of the pads. Anything to occupy the mind. Anything to keep the nerves from unraveling. The silence was broken by the distant cry of a hawk. It sounded thin and lonely in the vast space. Webb tilted his head. He was listening for something else. He was listening for the creak of leather, the rattle of chains, the iron strike of a tire on stone, the sounds of the approaching payload. The wind shifted slightly, blowing up the canyon from the south. If the convoy was near, the sound would carry. He heard it. A faint, rhythmic crunching. It was still miles away, carried on the updraft, but it was distinct. It was the sound of heavy wheels grinding through gravel. Webb held up a hand. The men froze. They heard it too. The waiting was over. The preparation phase was ending. The operational phase was beginning. They shifted into their firing positions, settling their bodies against the hard ground. They rested the forestocks of their rifles on the stones, cushioning them with their hands or hats to prevent the barrel from jumping on recoil. They checked their sight pictures one last time. The road was empty, a blank stage waiting for the actors. They knew exactly where the wagon would be when they opened fire. They had the spot marked in their minds. A specific patch of bare rock, a specific bush. When the driver's head crossed that line, the canyon would explode. Webb looked down the line of his men. They were grim, dusty, and ready. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. They were the hunters. The prey was approaching. The fort they had built was strong. The high ground was theirs. They had every advantage. They gripped their weapons, their knuckles white. The sound of the approaching wagon grew louder, a steady, inevitable crescendo. The grind of the wheels, the snort of a mule, the voice of a driver urging the team on. It was coming, the gold, the silver, the violence. They lay flat, becoming part of the rock. To anyone looking up from the road, the ridge was lifeless, just stone and scrub and heat. But behind the stone curtain, 12 rifles were cocked, 12 fingers were resting on triggers, and 12 men were holding their breath, waiting to turn the silence into a slaughter. The trap was set, the lock was turned, and the key was thrown away. The convoy pushed deeper into the afternoon. the sun positioning itself to strike the western faces of the canyon walls as the terrain grew increasingly hostile. The relatively flat expanse of the Gila Valley floor had given way to a tortured landscape of eroded sandstone and volcanic uplift. The road, which had been a straight, predictable scar across the desert, now convulsed into a series of sharp switchbacks and sudden dips that tested the structural integrity of the wagons and the patience of the drivers. Major Joseph Wham fought the steering of the ambulance, his gloved hands cramping from the constant vibration transmitted through the leather reins. Every rock the iron tires struck sent a jolt up the wooden frame, rattling the teeth of the passengers and shaking the heavy strongbox bolted to the floorboards. The heat was absolute. It radiated from the ground in visible waves, distorting the shapes of the scrub oak and mesquite that clung to the slopes. The dust kicked up by the lead mules no longer drifted away on the breeze. It hung in the stagnant air of the ravines, coating the men in a fine, choking powder that turned their blue uniforms a uniform shade of gray. Sweat cut channels through the grime on their faces. The soldiers in the rear escort wagon sat in a stupor of endurance, their bodies swaying in unison with the lurching of the vehicle. Private Hamilton uncorked his canteen and took a mouthful of warm water, swishing it around to clear the grit from his teeth before swallowing. The water offered no refreshment, only hydration. Ahead of the main column, Corporal Isaiah Mays and Private Benjamin Burge rode point. Their horses were lathered, the white foam of sweat gathering under the edges of the saddle blankets. Mays kept his eyes on the trail, scanning the ground for loose shale that might cause a stumble. The road here was cut directly into the side of the hill, a narrow shelf with a steep rise on one side and a sharp drop-off into the dry creek bed on the other. It was a classic choke point. Mays felt the tactical disadvantage of the position. If they were engaged here, there was nowhere to maneuver. The horses were skittish, their ears swiveling back and forth, reacting to the echoes of the wagons behind them. The column approached the specific section of the route known as the crossing at Cottonwood Wash. Here, the road descended sharply from the high ground, bottomed out in the gravel of the wash itself, and then climbed the opposing ridge in a steep, straight ascent. The grade on the far side was severe, requiring the mules to dig in and pull with everything they had. Wham shifted his foot on the brake lever, easing the ambulance down the decline. The brake block screeched against the iron tires, a piercing sound that sliced through the silence of the canyon. The heavy wagon slid slightly in the loose dirt, the rear wheels locking up before regaining traction. Wham cursed softly, sawing on the reins to keep the team straight. They reached the bottom of the wash. The air here was cooler, pooled in the shade of the canyon walls, but the relief was temporary. The road ahead loomed like a wall. The track climbed out of the creek bed and ran along a ledge carved into the rock face. To the left was the hill, rising abruptly toward the skyline. To the right was a ravine choked with brush and boulders. The road was barely wide enough for a single wagon. There was no room to turn around. There was no room to pass. It was a one-way chute. Mays and Burge started up the grade first. Their horses scrambled for footing on the slick rock surfaces exposed by the wear of traffic. The iron shoes sparked against the stone. They rode slowly, their bodies leaning forward in the saddles to help the animals balance. They reached a point halfway up the ascent where the road curved slightly around a protruding shoulder of the ridge. As they cleared the visual obstruction of the curve, Mays pulled his horse to a sudden, hard stop. Directly in the center of the track, blocking the path completely, lay a massive boulder. It was not a piece of loose scree that had tumbled down from the heights. It was a slab of granite, roughly 4 feet in diameter, heavy, jagged, and immovable by anything less than a coordinated effort. It sat squarely between the ruts, its positioning so precise that it left no room on either side for the wheels of a wagon to squeeze past. To the left was the vertical rock face. To the right, the edge of the ravine. Mays stared at the rock. His first instinct was to scan the heights. He looked up at the ridge line that towered over them to the left. The sun was behind the rim, casting the upper slopes in shadow. He saw nothing but rocks and brush, no movement, no glint of metal. He looked back at the boulder. The placement felt deliberate. A rock of that size falling naturally would have likely carried momentum, rolling across the road and into the ravine below. For it to stop dead center required a very specific trajectory or human hands. Private Burge brought his horse up alongside Mays. He looked at the obstruction and then back down the hill toward the approaching wagons. He shook his head. They were stuck. The ambulance could not climb over it, and the road was too narrow to back the team down safely. The only option was to remove it. Burge stood in his stirrups looking for a way around. There was none. The brush on the ravine side was thick, concealing a drop of unknown depth. The uphill side was a wall. Major Wham's ambulance began the ascent. The mules strained against the collars, their hooves digging into the gravel. The wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of the gold. Wham saw the two cavalrymen stopped ahead. He shouted, asking for the status. Mays turned in his saddle and signaled with his hand, palm flat, pressing down. Stop. Obstruction. Wham pulled back on the reins, shouting, "Whoa!" to the team. The mules stopped willingly, grateful for the break in the climb. The ambulance rolled back a few inches before the brakes bit into the wheels. The escort wagon behind them stopped as well, the sudden halt causing the soldiers in the back to grab the sideboards to steady themselves. The convoy sat motionless on the steep grade, the animals breathing heavily, their sides heaving. The sound of their respiration was loud in the confined space. Mays trotted his horse back down to the major's position. He reported the situation tersely. There was a rock in the road, a big one. It was blocking the entire track. Wham frowned, wiping sweat from his eyes. He asked if it could be bypassed. Mays replied in the negative. The road was fouled. They would have to clear it. Wham set the handbrake on the ambulance, locking the lever in place with a heavy iron pawl. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down from the box. His boots hit the ground with a thud. He stretched his legs, feeling the stiffness in his knees. He walked up the hill, followed by Clerk Gibbon, who carried the account books. Sergeant Brown climbed down from the escort wagon and joined them, signaling for his men to dismount but stay with the vehicles for the moment. The group walked up the 50 yards to where the boulder sat. Up close, the obstacle was even more formidable. It was a rough, craggy piece of stone, gray and weathered. It looked ancient, yet its position on the road surface was fresh. There was no accumulation of wind-blown dust around its base. It had been placed there recently. Wham kicked it with the toe of his boot. It was solid. It weighed perhaps 500 pounds, maybe more. Sergeant Brown examined the ground around the rock. He looked for tracks. The surface of the road was hard, a mix of baked clay and stone. It did not hold footprints well. However, he noticed some scrapes on the rock face of the hill, marks that suggested leverage bars might have been used to pry the stone loose from an outcropping above or perhaps to roll it into position from the side. He said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. He looked up at the ridge again. The feeling of being watched was palpable. The canyon felt too quiet. Wham assessed the labor required. They needed to move the rock to the right, tumbling it over the edge into the ravine. To do that, they would need leverage, they would need tools, and they would need hands. He turned to Sergeant Brown and ordered him to bring the escort forward. They would use the axe and the pry bars from the wagon kit. Brown walked back down to the escort wagon. He ordered the infantrymen to dismount. The soldiers climbed out of the back, stretching their limbs. They were tired, dusty, and hot. They grumbled quietly about the road maintenance, or lack thereof. They grounded their rifles, leaning them against the wheels of the escort wagon or holding them loosely by the barrels. Brown instructed them to leave their packs but bring the tools. Private Hamilton grabbed a heavy felling axe. Private Arrington found a crowbar. The soldiers walked up the hill in a loose group, their boots scuffing on the rocks. They approached the boulder with the resignation of men used to manual labor. This was just another task in the endless litany of soldiering duties. Digging latrines, building walls, moving rocks. They did not deploy in a tactical formation. There was no enemy visible. There was only a rock. The threat was geological, not martial. Wham directed the effort. He pointed to the gap between the boulder and the hillside. He wanted the crowbar wedged in there. If they could get a bite on the stone, they could lever it outward. Arrington jammed the point of the bar into the dirt, searching for a fulcrum. He found a smaller stone and kicked it into place, resting the bar against it. He leaned his weight on the iron, testing the purchase. The boulder shifted slightly, grinding against the roadbed, but it did not roll. It was too heavy for one man. Wham ordered more men to the bar. 2 soldiers joined Arrington, gripping the cold iron. They counted off. 1, 2, 3. Heave. They pushed down. The rock groaned. It lifted an inch, then settled back as the bar slipped. They cursed. The iron scraped against the granite, creating a spark and a smell of burning metal. Private Young suggested they use the axe to dig out the earth on the ravine side, undercutting the rock so it would roll of its own accord. Wham agreed. Hamilton stepped forward with the axe, swinging it into the hard-packed dirt at the edge of the road. The blade struck with a dull thud, chipping away the clay. It was slow work. The ground was like concrete. Hamilton swung again, the effort making him grunt. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the dust. The rest of the escort stood around the rock, waiting for their turn to push. They had left their rifles stacked or leaning against the canyon wall a few feet away. It was impossible to work the heavy stone while holding a weapon. The rifles were within reach, perhaps 10 feet away, but they were not in their hands. The men wiped their faces with bandanas. They talked in low voices about the size of the rock, speculating on where it had come from. Corporal Mays and Private Burge remained mounted, but they had moved their horses slightly further up the road to give the work party room. They were looking north toward Fort Thomas, watching the road ahead. They were effectively cut off from the main body by the activity at the rock. The convoy was strung out over 50 yards of steep grade. The ambulance was at the bottom of the incline, the escort wagon behind it, and the majority of the soldiers were clustered at the top around the obstruction. The geography of the halt was a tactical nightmare. The soldiers were bunched together, focused on a single point of engineering standing in the open. The vertical separation between the vehicles and the men meant that the unit was fragmented. If an order was shouted from the rock, it might not be heard clearly by the drivers at the wagons over the noise of the wind and the scraping of the tools. Wham stood with his hands on his hips, watching the progress. He was impatient. Every minute spent here was a minute of delay. The sun was moving. He wanted to be at Fort Thomas. He calculated the time lost. 10 minutes? 20? It depended on how stubborn the rock was. He stepped forward to lend a hand, grabbing a jagged edge of the granite. He pulled, testing the weight. It was immovable. He realized they needed to break the suction of the dirt. "Dig deeper," he ordered Hamilton. "Get under the corner." Hamilton swung the axe again. The blade bit deep. He levered the handle, popping a clod of earth loose. The rock shifted. It was teetering. Wham saw the opportunity. He called for everyone to push. The soldiers crowded around the stone, finding handholds. They put their shoulders against it. The blue wool of their uniforms pressed against the gray dust of the rock. "Ready," Wham said. "Push." They strained. Boots slipped on the gravel. Muscles bunched. The rock began to tip. It ground slowly toward the edge of the ravine. The friction was immense. The sound of stone on stone was a low growl. Above them, the ridge was silent. The brush did not move. The birds had stopped singing. The only sound in the canyon was the labored breathing of the men and the scraping of the rock. The world had narrowed down to this single physical struggle. The broader context of the mission, the gold, the army, the destination, had faded. There was only the rock. Sergeant Brown, standing slightly apart to oversee the effort, felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He looked up at the cliff again. The angle was steep. If someone was up there, they would be looking right down on top of them. He scanned the rim. He saw the dark shapes of rocks against the sky. They looked natural. But the silence bothered him. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a storm about to break. He took a step toward the stack of rifles. He didn't pick one up, but he moved closer. It was an instinct he couldn't explain. The men at the rock gave a collective shout as the stone finally yielded. It rolled once, lurching onto its side. It was now balanced precariously on the lip of the ravine. One more good shove would send it over. They repositioned themselves for the final effort. They were bunched tight, shoulder to shoulder, a mass of blue and brass. They were completely exposed. They were working hard, their focus absolute. The mules down at the ambulance swished their tails, swatting at flies. The driver, sitting on the box, held the brake lever, his foot resting on the dashboard. He looked up at the men working. He was bored. He wanted to get moving. He reached into his pocket for a plug of tobacco. The canyon walls amplified the sounds of the work party. The clink of the crowbar, the grunt of exertion, the thud of boots. It echoed up and down the wash. It was a noise that masked any other sound. The cocking of a hammer, the shifting of a body behind a stone wall. The convoy was alone in the wilderness, halted by a piece of geology that had no business being there. Wham wiped his hands on his trousers. He was satisfied. The road would be clear in a moment. He looked at the sun. They could make up the time on the flats beyond the pass. He turned to Gibbon. "Get ready to move," he said. Gibbon nodded and started walking back down the hill toward the ambulance. The soldiers prepared for the final heave. They dug their heels in. They took a deep breath. The air was hot and dry in their lungs. They did not know that they were inhaling the last peaceful breath of the day. They did not know that the rock was not an accident of nature, but a key that unlocked a door to violence. They pushed. The rock moved. The friction of the stone sliding was the only warning they got. It was a harsh grinding noise that covered the sound of 12 fingers tightening on 12 triggers. The ambush was perfectly set. The victims were perfectly positioned. The geography had done its work. The trap was closed, the road was blocked, the men were dismounted, and the gold was sitting still. The stage was set for the ridge to speak. The precise moment the granite boulder yielded to the collective muscle of the infantrymen marked the final second of peace in the Gila Valley. The heavy stone ground against the bedrock, scraping a white scar into the path as it tipped toward the ravine's edge, signaling a job well done to the sweating soldiers. Private Hamilton straightened his back, his hands stinging from the vibration of the axe handle, and wiped a smear of mud from his forehead. The men exhaled in unison, a collective release of breath that coincided with a sudden sharp motion from the ridgeline above. It was not a bird or a shifting shadow, but the distinct mechanical rise of a rifle barrel leveling over the stone breastwork. Before any soldier could process the visual input or translate the shape into a threat, the silence of the canyon was shattered by the high-pitched crack of a Winchester rifle. The first bullet did not find a human target but struck the iron tire of the Escort wagon's rear wheel with a violence that sent a spray of lead fragments and sparks into the dry grass. The sound was distinct from the dull thud of tools. It was the angry, snapping report of supersonic flight. For a fraction of a second, the soldiers stood frozen, their minds struggling to bridge the gap between the mundane labor of road clearing and the sudden intrusion of lethal force. That brief paralysis was the window the ambushers had calculated for. Following the signal shot, the entire ridgeline erupted in a coordinated volley. 12 weapons fired almost simultaneously, the individual reports blending into a single rolling thunderclap that echoed off the canyon walls, amplifying the noise until it was physically painful. The air around the soldiers instantly filled with the hiss and snap of incoming rounds. The bullets, fired from an elevation of 40 feet and a distance of less than 50 yards, arrived with devastating velocity. They kicked up geysers of dust around the men's boots, creating a localized fog of grit. Private Hamilton, still standing near the boulder, felt a tug at his sleeve as a slug passed through the fabric of his tunic, missing his flesh by a fraction of an inch, but leaving a burn mark on the wool. He dropped the axe and threw himself to the ground, instinctively seeking the cover of the very rock they had just labored to move. The boulder, previously an obstacle, was now the only solid protection on the exposed shelf. Major Wham, standing near the edge of the road, reacted with the reflexes of a veteran. He did not look for the source of the fire. The acoustics of the canyon made the location obvious. The shots were plunging down from the left. He dove toward the shallow ditch on the uphill side of the road, shouting for the men to take cover. His voice was nearly drowned out by the continuous roar of the gunfire. The bandits were not conserving ammunition. They were working the levers of their repeating rifles as fast as mechanics allowed, pumping a steady stream of lead into the kill zone. The rate of fire was overwhelming, suppressing any immediate attempt by the soldiers to reach their stacked rifles. The stack of Springfield rifles leaning against the rock face 10 feet away from the work party became the focal point of the desperation. The weapons were loaded, but they were out of reach. Private Arrington scrambled on his hands and knees toward them, the gravel cutting into his palms. A bullet struck the ground inches from his face, spraying dirt into his eyes. He squeezed them shut, flinching, but forced himself to keep moving. The distance was short, yet crossing it required traversing a zone where the air was thick with flying metal. He reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth wood of a stock, and grabbed the nearest rifle, dragging it back toward the cover of the boulder. Behind him, Private Young was not as fortunate. As he turned to run for the shelter of the escort wagon, a heavy-caliber slug struck him in the thigh. The impact was audible, a wet slap that knocked his leg out from under him. He collapsed onto the hard-packed road, sliding in the dust. The pain was not immediate, masked by the shock of the blow, but the mechanical failure of his limb was instant. He tried to stand, but his leg refused to support his weight. He crawled, dragging the injured limb, leaving a trail of dark blood on the white stones. He managed to roll into the depression of the drainage ditch just as a second bullet plowed into the ground where his chest had been a second before. The mules attached to the ambulance and the escort wagon reacted with primal terror. The sudden noise, the smell of gunpowder, and the whiz of bullets provoked an immediate flight response. The team on the ambulance reared, their iron shoes clattering frantically on the stone surface. They twisted in the harness, the leaders trying to turn back while the wheelers tried to surge forward. The wagon jerked violently, the strong box slamming against the sideboards. The driver, still on the box, fought the reins with desperate strength. He stood up, planting his feet wide on the slanted floorboard, shouting at the animals, but his voice was lost in the cacophony. A bullet shattered the wooden dashboard inches from his knee, sending splinters flying. He realized the position was untenable. He set the brake as hard as he could and leaped from the moving wagon, hitting the ground and rolling toward the cliff face. The escort wagon, positioned further down the slope, was in even greater danger. The mules there had swung the front wheels hard to the left, jackknifing the vehicle. The wagon teetered, the left rear wheel lifting off the ground. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the entire load, rations, ammunition, and bedding would tip over the edge into the ravine. The weight of the supplies held it down, slamming back onto the road with a bone-jarring crash. The animals continued to kick and buck, tangling their legs in the traces. One mule went down, thrashing on the ground, effectively anchoring the team but creating a chaotic knot of horseflesh and leather that blocked any potential retreat. Corporal Isaiah Mays and Private Benjamin Burge, isolated further up the road, found themselves in a crossfire. The bandits had extended their line enough to cover the northern approach. Bullets pecked at the rocks around their horses' hooves. The animals were dancing uncontrollably, terrified by the noise. Mays knew they were sitting ducks in the saddle. He shouted to Burge to dismount. They swung down from their horses, slapping the animals on the rumps to send them scattering up the road, away from the kill zone. The horses bolted, their stirrups flapping wildly, disappearing around the bend. Mays and Burge dropped behind a low outcrop of rock, unlimbering their carbines. They were the only soldiers with weapons immediately in hand. Mays brought his carbine to his shoulder, trying to acquire a target on the ridge. The sun was high, but the bandits were well concealed behind their stone wall. All Mays could see were the puffs of white smoke jetting out from the crevices in the rocks. He aimed at a cluster of smoke and fired. The recoil of the carbine dug into his shoulder. He worked the action, ejecting the spent brass casing which spun through the air and landed with a tinkling sound on the stone. He fired again. It was suppressive fire, an attempt to force the attackers to keep their heads down, but the volume of incoming fire did not slacken. The bandits had the advantage of numbers, position, and preparation. Down at the main ambush site, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The soldiers huddled behind the boulder, and the shallow ditch were pinned. They could not lift their heads without drawing fire. The air above them was a distinct lethal zone. Bullets snapped through the brush, cutting twigs and leaves that drifted down onto the pinned men like confetti. The smell of black powder drifted down from the ridge, a sulphurous, biting odor that coated the throat. The heat of the day, combined with the adrenaline, made the thirst unbearable, but the canteens were in the wagons or on the belts of men too terrified to reach for them. Major Wham, crouched behind a small protrusion of rock near the ditch, drew the rifle he had taken from a wounded trooper. The range was too great for a hurried shot to be effective, but the weapon offered a psychological crutch. He looked around, assessing his command. He saw Young bleeding in the ditch. He saw Hamilton pressed flat behind the boulder. He saw the rest of the squad scattered, some behind the wagon wheels, some in the ditch. The unit integrity was shattered. They were no longer a squad. They were individuals fighting for survival. Wham realized that they needed to return fire to break the momentum of the ambush. If they stayed pinned, the bandits would flank them or pick them off one by one. "Fire! Return fire!" Wham screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. "Don't let them pin you." Sergeant Brown, who had managed to retrieve his rifle during the initial scramble, heard the order. He was positioned near the rear wheel of the escort wagon. He rolled out from cover, assuming a prone firing position. He was a marksman, and despite the chaos, his training took over. He settled the front sight blade into the notch of the rear sight, ignoring the dust kicking up around him. He saw a hat visible above the bandit's breastwork. He squeezed the trigger. The Springfield roared, the heavy .45-70 bullet slamming into the rocks on the ridge. He saw the hat disappear. He didn't know if he had hit the man, but he had forced him to duck. "Get those rifles working," Brown bellowed to his men. "Give it back to them." Encouraged by the sergeant's action, two other privates who had secured their weapons began to fire. The rhythmic boom of the army rifles began to intersperse with the sharper cracks of the Winchesters. The battle was no longer one-sided. The soldiers were fighting back. The sheer power of the government cartridges began to degrade the bandits' cover. The heavy lead bullets smashed into the loose stones of the breastworks, shattering them and sending rock splinters flying into the faces of the outlaws. However, the bandits had anticipated resistance. They shifted their fire from the men to the animals. A deliberate volley was directed at the mules of the ambulance. If the mules went down, the wagon was immobile. A bullet struck the near-wheeler in the neck. The animal screamed, a terrible high-pitched sound that cut through the gunfire. It collapsed, dragging the other mule down with it. The ambulance lurched and settled as the weight of the dead animal anchored it to the road. The vehicle was now a permanent fixture in the kill zone. The gold was stuck. The intensity of the firefight increased, the canyon filled with smoke which hung in the still air, obscuring vision. The combat became a series of muzzle flashes seen through a gray haze. The noise was constant, a deafening roar that made communication impossible. Men communicated by gesture or by shouting directly into each other's ears. The dust turned to mud where it mixed with the sweat and blood on the soldiers' uniforms. Private Hamilton, still behind the boulder, saw a movement on the ridge to the right. A bandit was trying to flank them, moving through the brush to get a better angle on the men in the ditch. Hamilton raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the granite. He tracked the movement. He waited for a clear shot. The bandit stepped out from behind a mesquite bush. Hamilton fired. The bandit spun around and fell, disappearing into the undergrowth. Hamilton didn't celebrate. He immediately reloaded, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the cartridge. The reality of the ambush was settling in. This was not a hit and run. The attackers were not leaving. They were digging in, pouring fire into the road, determined to wipe out the escort. The sheer volume of ammunition they were expending suggested they had brought thousands of rounds. They were prepared for a siege. The soldiers, by contrast, had only what was in their belts. The reserve ammunition was in the escort wagon, which was currently being riddled with bullets. Clerk Gibbon, who had taken cover behind the rear axle of the ambulance, found himself staring at the wooden spokes of the wheel as they splintered under impact. He was a civilian, not a soldier, and the terror he felt was paralyzing. He clutched his Winchester, but his fingers were too stiff to work the lever. He watched as a bullet passed through the wagon bed, punching a hole in the wood inches from his face. The realization that the wagon itself offered no real protection dawned on him. The wood was soft. The bullets passed through it as if it were paper. The only thing stopping the rounds was the strongbox and the sacks of grain. On the ridge, the bandits were shouting to one another, coordinating their fire. They called out specific targets. "Get the one by the wheel! Watch the ditch!" Their voices were audible during the brief lulls in firing, taunting the soldiers below. They felt invincible in their stone fortress. They had the high ground, the cover, and the initiative. They were methodically suppressing the army regulars. Wilfred Webb, the leader of the gang, stood comfortably behind the thickest part of the wall, firing his revolver at the soldiers who were trying to regroup near the ditch. He was calm, picking his shots. He saw Major Wham trying to direct the defense. He aimed at the officer. The bullet kicked up dirt between Wham's legs. Wham didn't flinch. He stayed focused on his men. Webb admired the courage, but he intended to kill him nonetheless. The heat in the canyon became a secondary enemy. The sun, now angling directly into the faces of the soldiers, blinded them. They had to squint against the glare to see the ridge. The bandits, with the sun behind them, had a perfect view. It was another tactical advantage of the chosen time and place. The environment itself was weaponized against the escort. Private Arrington, having exhausted the ammunition in his rifle, rolled onto his back to reload. He pulled a cartridge from his belt. His hands were slippery with sweat. He dropped the round in the dirt. He cursed, groping for it in the dust. He found it, wiped it off on his trousers, and jammed it into the breech. He snapped the trapdoor shut and rolled back over. He fired blindly at the ridge just to keep their heads down. The medical reality of the skirmish began to manifest. Private Young in the ditch was growing pale. The wound in his thigh was bleeding freely, soaking his trousers and pooling in the dust. He tried to apply pressure with his hands, but the blood welled up between his fingers. He needed a tourniquet, but he couldn't reach his belt. He felt cold despite the 100-degree heat. Shock was setting in. He looked at the sky, which seemed to be turning a washed-out white. Sergeant Brown saw Young's condition. He knew he had to do something, but to move from his position was suicide. The air between the wagon and the ditch was crisscrossed with lead. He shouted at Young to hold on. Young nodded weakly, his eyes losing focus. The first 5 minutes of the engagement felt like an hour. The relentless intensity of the violence warped the perception of time. Every second was punctuated by a near miss or an impact. The soldiers were trapped in a bubble of noise and fear. They were fighting not for the gold anymore, but for the next breath. The gold was just metal in a box. Their lives were the currency being spent now. The bandits, seeing the soldiers pinned, began to increase the pressure. They started firing at the rocks above the road, trying to dislodge loose stones that would rain down on the men below. A shower of gravel and fist-sized rocks clattered down the cliff face, adding to the misery of the soldiers in the ditch. It was a cruel, inventive tactic that forced the men to curl up into tight balls to protect their heads. The ambush had transitioned from the initial shock to a grinding attrition. The soldiers were not dead, but they were neutralized. They were pinned, wounded, and disorganized. The initiative remained entirely with the men on the ridge. Major Wham, realizing that their position on the road was becoming a grave, began to formulate a desperate plan. They needed to move. They needed to get to better cover. But the only cover was the creek bed below the road, a drop of 10 feet into the gravel wash. To get there, they would have to abandon the wagons. They would have to abandon the pay. Wham looked at the strongbox. It sat heavy and mute in the ambulance. He looked at his men. They were bleeding and terrified. The choice was becoming clear. Save the money or save the command. But for the moment, even retreat was impossible. To stand up was to die. They were pinned by a sheet of lead that showed no sign of lifting. The initiation of fire had been a complete success for the Outlaws. They had turned the canyon into a slaughterhouse, and the butcher's bill was just beginning to be tallied. The geometry of the ambush created a lethal enclosure from which there was no immediate escape. The section of the road where the convoy had halted was a shelf cut into the canyon wall, bordered by a vertical rise on the left and a sheer drop on the right, effectively turning the space into a three-dimensional trap. The bandits on the ridge did not need to aim with surgical precision. They simply needed to saturate the narrow corridor with lead. The plunging fire, descending at a steep 40-degree angle, negated the cover offered by the wagon wheels and the low stone wall of the drainage ditch. A soldier crouching behind a wheel might be protected from a shot fired on a level plane, but against fire raining down from above, the wheel offered no more shelter than a shadow. The bullet struck the ground behind the cover, skipping off the hardpan and slamming into legs, boots, and equipment. The first 30 minutes of the engagement were defined by a systematic suppression of the 24th Infantry. The volume of incoming fire was so intense that the air above the road surface became a physical barrier. Any soldier who attempted to lift his head to acquire a target was immediately forced back down by the snap of high-velocity rounds passing inches from his skull. The dust kicked up by the impacts formed a low-hanging cloud that hovered over the kill zone, obscuring the vision of the defenders while marking their positions for the attackers. The bandits fired into the dust clouds, walking their shots back and forth across the area where they knew the men were huddled. Private Hamilton lay flat on his stomach behind the boulder they had just moved, his face pressed into the dirt. He could feel the vibrations of the bullets striking the other side of the granite rock. The stone, which had been cool in the morning shade, was now absorbing the kinetic energy of repeated impacts, sending stone chips flying into the air. Hamilton tried to push himself deeper into the ground, his fingers digging into the gravel. He was conscious of the fact that his legs were exposed, sticking out slightly beyond the curvature of the rock. He drew them up, curling his body into the tightest possible fetal position. A bullet struck the heel of his boot, tearing the leather and sending a shockwave up his leg, but missing the flesh. He gasped, the sound lost in the roar of the gunfire. The mules attached to the ambulance became the primary focus of the destruction. The bandits understood that mobility was the army's only hope, and they methodically set about destroying the motive power of the convoy. The lead mules, already panicked by the noise, were struck repeatedly. One animal took a round in the flank, causing it to kick out violently, shattering the wooden singletree connecting it to the wagon. The mule collapsed, thrashing in the traces, its hooves striking the metal tires of the ambulance with a ringing clang. The scent of fresh blood mixed instantly with the smell of gunpowder, a copper tang odor that triggered a primal fear in the surviving animals. The wheelers, the pair closest to the wagon, were trapped by the weight of the fallen leaders. They pulled against the harness, dragging the dead weight and the wagon sideways toward the cliff edge. The ambulance lurched, the rear right wheel slipping over the lip of the ravine. The vehicle teetered, the frame twisting. Inside the wagon, the strongbox slid across the floorboards, slamming into the sidewall with a force that cracked the wood. The weight of the gold acted as an anchor, keeping the wagon from tipping over completely, but the position was precarious. The ambulance was now effectively disabled, a stationary target listing at a dangerous angle. Major Wham, crouched in the shallow depression of the ditch, watched the destruction of his transport with a cold realization of their predicament. He saw the canvas cover of the ambulance jumping and tearing as bullets punched through the fabric. The interior of the wagon was being shredded. If anyone had remained inside, they would have been cut to pieces. The major shouted for his men to hold their fire and conserve ammunition, realizing that blind firing into the ridge was futile. They needed to wait for a target. However, the psychological need to do something, to respond to the violence, caused several soldiers to continue firing wildly, wasting precious cartridges on the stone breastworks above. The heat in the canyon intensified as the sun beat down on the trapped men. The rocks they were pressed against radiated temperatures that burned the skin through the wool of their uniforms. Thirst became an immediate, agonizing issue. The adrenaline coursing through their systems accelerated dehydration. Private Arrington, pinned near the rear of the escort wagon, reached for his canteen. As his fingers touched the canvas cover, a bullet struck the metal vessel, punching a hole through both sides. The water drained out in seconds, soaking his trousers with a warm, useless fluid. He stared at the ruined canteen, the reality of his vulnerability reinforcing the hopelessness of the position. The escort wagon itself was being systematically dismantled. The wood of the sideboards was splintering under the barrage. The crates of hardtack and rations stacked in the bed were perforated, spilling dried beef and biscuit crumbs onto the floor where they mixed with the dust and debris. A bullet struck a box of reserve ammunition, not detonating the rounds but smashing the cardboard cartons and scattering the heavy lead cartridges across the bed of the wagon. This supply, vital to their prolonged resistance, was now under direct fire, making any attempt to retrieve it a suicidal venture. The driver's seat was chewed up by lead, the leather upholstery torn to ribbons, the stuffing blown out like cotton snow. Sergeant Brown tried to rally the men nearest to him. He crawled toward Private Burge, who had abandoned his horse and joined the infantrymen on the ground. Brown's movement was low and reptilian, his elbows and knees scraping the rock. He reached Burge and grabbed him by the shoulder, shouting into his ear to watch the right flank. Brown was concerned that the bandits would send a party down the ravine to come up behind them. Burge nodded, his eyes wide, wiping dust from his shooting eye. He shifted his position, turning his rifle toward the drop-off, waiting for a silhouette to appear over the edge. The noise was a constant physical pressure. The distinct crack of the Winchesters from the ridge was distinguishable from the deeper boom of the Army Springfields, creating a rhythmic dissonance. The canyon walls captured the sound and bounced it back, destroying any sense of directionality. It felt as if the shots were coming from everywhere at once. The soldiers were disoriented, their equilibrium shaken by the acoustic violence. A private near the front of the column clamped his hands over his ears for a second, dropping his rifle, unable to process the sensory overload. Major Wham saw him and threw a rock at the man, hitting him in the leg to snap him back to reality. The private grabbed his weapon again, shaking his head. On the ridge, the outlaws maintained a relentless pace of fire. They worked in shifts. While one man fired, the man next to him reloaded. This ensured that there was never a lull in the suppression. They had piles of cartridges on the rocks in front of them, the brass gleaming in the sun. They were not aiming at specific faces anymore. They were aiming at zones. They fired at the gap between the wagon wheels. They fired at the shadow behind the boulder. They fired at the ditch. They were playing the odds, knowing that eventually a bullet would find flesh. Down in the kill zone, the injuries began to accumulate not just from direct hits, but from the environment itself. Stone splinters sheared off the canyon wall by bullet impacts acted like shrapnel. Private Thornton was struck in the cheek by a shard of granite, opening a gash that bled profusely down his neck. He slapped a hand over the wound, feeling the warm slickness of blood, but kept his rifle raised. The dust in the air clogged their noses and throats, making it difficult to breathe. They coughed and gagged, the dry hacking sounds mixing with the gunfire. The mules of the escort wagon, terrified by the death of the ambulance team, finally broke. The harness leather, weakened by age and stress, snapped under the frantic lunging of the animals. Two of the mules broke free, galloping blindly up the road directly into the line of fire. They were cut down within 20 yards, their bodies tumbling in the dust, adding to the obstacle course of the roadway. The remaining mules were tangled in the wreckage of the wagon tongue, kicking helplessly. One animal had a broken leg, the bone protruding through the skin, and its cries were a terrible, high-pitched counterpoint to the battle. Major Wham realized that the formation was shattered. They were no longer a convoy. They were a collection of isolated men pinned in a kill box. The concept of escort had vanished. The mission had shifted from protection of the payload to self-preservation. He looked at the strongbox again. It was 40 feet away across a patch of open ground that was being churned up by bullets. It might as well have been 40 miles. To move toward the box was death. To stay where they were was death deferred. The bandits began to target the specific cover the soldiers were using. A marksman on the ridge focused on the gap beneath the ambulance. He saw the legs of Clerk Gibbon and fired a series of shots into the space. The bullets kicked up gravel into Gibbon's face and legs. Gibbon scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the wagon, exposing himself for a second before diving behind a cluster of sagebrush. The brush offered concealment but no cover. A bullet clipped the top of the bush, trimming the branches as if with shears. Gibbon pressed his face into the roots of the plant, praying for invisibility. The sheer brute force of the ambush was wearing down the psychological resistance of the troops. They were regulars, disciplined and trained, but the situation was militarily untenable. They were receiving fire from an elevated fortified position while standing on an open shelf. Every manual of arms dictated that such a position should be abandoned. Yet the presence of the payroll anchored them. They could not leave the gold. This conflict between tactical necessity and duty created a paralysis in the unit. They stayed and bled because they were ordered to guard the box. Private Young in the ditch was growing weaker. The blood loss from his thigh wound was significant. He tried to tie a handkerchief around his leg, but his hands were slick with blood and the knot would not hold. He looked at Sergeant Brown, his eyes asking for help. Brown saw him but could do nothing. To move into the open to render aid would result in 2 casualties instead of 1. Brown shouted encouragement, telling Young to keep pressure on it, but his voice was swallowed by the din. The devastating accuracy of the bandits was aided by the lack of smoke from their position. The slight breeze at the top of the ridge carried their powder smoke away, keeping their view clear. In contrast, the smoke from the soldiers' black powder rifles hung in the stagnant air of the wash, blinding them. They were firing into the glare of the sun while wrapped in a fog of their own making. It was a one-sided blinding. A bullet struck the axle of the ambulance, shattering the cast iron. The wagon groaned and settled further, the wheel canting inward. The destruction of the vehicle was nearly complete. It was being reduced to a pile of wood and iron junk. The majestic symbol of the paymaster's authority was now just debris blocking the road. The gold inside was trapped in a cage of broken timber. The first 30 minutes had accomplished the bandits' primary objective, the neutralization of the escort's offensive capability. The soldiers were not maneuvering. They were not advancing. They were barely returning effective fire. They were simply existing in the space where the bullets were landing. The kill zone was living up to its name. It was a space where life was measured in inches and seconds. Private Hamilton, sensing the lull in fire from a specific section of the wall, raised up to fire. He got off 1 shot before a return volley forced him down. He checked his ammunition belt. He had fired 10 rounds. He had 30 left. He looked at the reserve crates in the wagon. They were unreachable. The logistical reality set in. They would run out of ammunition long before the bandits did. The outlaws had pack horses loaded with supplies. The soldiers were cut off from theirs. The sun moved imperceptibly across the sky, changing the shadows. The shadow of the ridge began to creep across the road, offering a slight relief from the glare but not the heat. The temperature in the canyon was well over 100 degrees. The soldiers were baking in their wool uniforms. Sweat ran into their eyes, stinging like acid. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. One of the bandits on the ridge stood up, mocking the soldiers, waving his hat. Corporal Mays, from his position further up the road, saw the movement. He took careful aim with his carbine. He fired. The bandit dropped back down instantly. It was a small victory, a reminder that the soldiers were still dangerous, but it did not change the tactical equation. The bandits laughed, their voices drifting down. They knew they were winning. The ground around the soldiers was littered with brass casings, both their own and the few that had fallen from the ridge. The road was scarred with hundreds of impact marks, white gouges in the rock. It looked as if the earth had been whipped. The air smelled of sulfur, blood, horse sweat, and fear. It was the atmosphere of a slaughterhouse. Major Wham checked the rifle he had taken from a wounded trooper. He had not fired it. It was a symbol of his impotence in this long-range engagement. He looked at the faces of his men. They were grim, dirty, and terrified. He knew that the breaking point was approaching. No unit could sustain this level of suppression indefinitely without taking casualties or breaking contact. The choice was rapidly approaching: die on the road or retreat to the creek bed. The firing from the ridge intensified again, a surge of violence designed to break the will of the survivors. The bullets came in a wave, a sheet of metal rain. The soldiers curled tighter into their cover. The mules screamed again. The wood of the wagon splintered. The kill zone was absolute. The trap was holding. The gold was waiting. And the men of the 24th Infantry were beginning to understand that an army escort was indeed not enough. The narrative of the engagement at Cottonwood Wash shifted from a story of collective victimization to one of individual defiance through the actions of Sergeant Benjamin Brown. Up until this juncture, the soldiers of the 24th Infantry had been reacting to the overwhelming initiative of the ambushers, absorbing fire in a defensive posture that offered diminishing returns. Brown, crouched near the shattered remains of the escort wagon's rear wheel, recognized the tactical terminality of their position. The bandits were not merely suppressing them, they were methodically dissecting the unit. If the soldiers remained static, they would die in the dust. The sergeant, a man of 29 years with a decade of frontier service etched into his demeanor, decided to alter the geometry of the fight. Brown gripped his Springfield rifle, the wood of the stock slick with his own sweat and the grease from the wagon axle. He understood that to deliver effective fire he had to expose himself. The drainage ditch and the wheel offered protection only if one remained prone and passive. To kill the men on the ridge, he had to rise. Brown took a breath, filling his lungs with the acrid, sulfurous air, and rolled away from the wheel. He pushed himself up to a kneeling position in the open road, presenting a stark, blue-uniformed silhouette against the pale backdrop of the canyon floor. The reaction from the ridge was instantaneous. 7 to 13 rifles shifted their point of aim toward the sergeant. The air around him snapped with the passage of supersonic lead. Brown ignored the volume of fire, focusing his entire consciousness on the front sight of his weapon. He identified a gap in the stone breastwork where a bandit in a gray shirt was working the lever of a Winchester. Brown settled the blade of his sight on the center of the gap, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil of the .45-70 cartridge punched into his shoulder, a familiar and reassuring violence. Through the smoke, he saw the rock face explode inches from the bandit's head, sending the man scrambling back into cover. Brown did not retreat. He reached to his cartridge belt, pulled a fresh round, and opened the breech. The extractor kicked the hot brass casing out, spinning it into the dirt. He loaded the fresh round, snapped the breech shut, and acquired a new target. He was functioning as a single-man battery, drawing the fire of the entire outlaw gang to allow his men a fraction of a second to recover. "Pick your targets," he roared, his voice cutting through the din. "Don't fire at the rocks, wait for a man." Private James Young, bleeding in the ditch, saw his sergeant standing in the storm. The sight catalyzed a reserve of adrenaline in the wounded man. Young propped himself up on his elbows, ignoring the screaming pain in his thigh, and raised his rifle. He fired at the flash of a muzzle on the ridge. Private Hamilton, emboldened by Brown's refusal to die, shifted from his fetal position behind the boulder and began to deliver deliberate, aimed fire. For the first time in 40 minutes, the volume of return fire from the road became significant. However, the laws of probability were heavily weighted against Sergeant Brown. He was a stationary target in a kill zone engaging 12 protected marksmen. A bullet struck him in the abdomen. The impact was not a sharp pain, but a massive, blunt concussion, as if he had been struck by a sledgehammer. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of him, staggering him backward. He dropped to one knee, clutching his stomach. His fingers encountered the warm, wet slickness of blood soaking through his tunic. The physiological shock rippled through his system, a wave of nausea and coldness that threatened to collapse his vision. Brown gritted his teeth, biting down on the pain until his jaw ached. He refused to go down. He used his rifle as a crutch, planting the butt in the ground and forcing himself back up. He was now fighting two battles, one against the bandits and one against his own failing body. He raised the rifle again. His hands were shaking, but he steadied them by bracing his elbow against his side. He fired another round. The bandits, seeing that the sergeant was hit but still standing, intensified their efforts. They wanted him dead. He was the anchor of the defense. Removing him would collapse the unit. Further up the road, Corporal Isaiah Mays was engaged in his own private war. Cut off from the main body, Mays had taken cover behind a low outcropping of quartz and granite that offered scant protection. He was armed with a cavalry carbine, a weapon with less range and punch than the infantry rifles, but he wielded it with surgical precision. Mays saw the bandits trying to maneuver down the northern slope to flank the main group. He understood that if the outlaws reached the creek bed, they could sweep up the wash and shoot the soldiers in the back. Mays shifted his position, exposing his upper body to get a clear line of fire on the flanking party. He fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, the reports of his carbine sharp and distinct. The flanking bandits halted, pinned by the accuracy of the lone cavalryman. Mays reloaded, jamming cartridges into the loading gate. A bullet struck the rock in front of his face, sending razor-sharp stone splinters into his skin. He wiped the blood from his cheek and kept firing. Then, the inevitable occurred. A bullet fired from an oblique angle struck Mays in the leg. The heavy lead slug tore through muscle and grazed the bone, creating a wound of catastrophic proportion. Mays collapsed behind the rock, his leg useless. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike that drove into his hip. He gasped, his vision tunneling. He looked down at his leg. The trouser leg was already dark with blood. He realized he could no longer move effectively. He was anchored to this rock. Despite the injury, Mays did not drop his weapon. He dragged himself back up to the firing position, resting the barrel of the carbine on the rock. He could not run, but he could still shoot. He continued to guard the flank, a crippled sentinel preventing the encirclement of his comrades. His resistance bought precious minutes for the men in the ditch below, preventing the ambush from turning into a total massacre. Back at the wagons, Sergeant Brown was fading. The abdominal wound was critical. He was losing blood rapidly. His face had turned an ashen gray under the dust. Yet he continued to command. He saw Private Arrington fumbling with a jammed rifle. Brown crawled over to him, the movement agony, and took the weapon. He cleared the jam with a violent rack of the mechanism and handed it back. "Keep firing," he whispered, his voice losing its timbre. "Don't let them down." The bandits, frustrated by the stubbornness of the resistance, decided to end it. Wilfred Webb signaled for a concentrated volley on the sergeant. 4 rifles aimed at Brown simultaneously. A second bullet struck him in the arm, shattering the bone. The impact spun him around and he fell heavily into the dirt. The rifle flew from his grasp. This time he could not get up. The structural integrity of his body had failed. He lay on his back, staring up at the blinding white sky, the sounds of the battle drifting in and out of focus. Even prone and shattered, Brown did not surrender his command. He shouted orders from the ground. "Watch the left. Keep your heads down. Fire low." His presence, even as a casualty, remained the psychological spine of the squad. The men heard his voice and knew that their sergeant was still with them. They continued to fight, driven by shame and respect. They could not abandon the fight while Brown was still breathing. Major Wham, seeing his sergeant fall, crawled over to him. He examined the wounds. They were grievous. Wham knew that Brown needed a surgeon immediately or he would die. But there was no surgeon. There was only the dirt, the heat, and the bullets. Wham placed a hand on Brown's shoulder. "Easy, Sergeant," he said. "You've done enough." Brown shook his head weakly. "Not enough, sir. The box. The box." His obsession with the duty remained intact even as his lifeblood leaked into the Arizona soil. He tried to reach for his revolver with his good hand, but his fingers were numb. The nerve damage was severe. The brutality of the engagement had reached its zenith. The road was a tableau of carnage. The dead mules lay in heaps, their carcasses riddled with bullets. The wagons were splintered wrecks. The soldiers were a collection of broken men. Private Thornton was unconscious from blood loss. Private Young was barely conscious. Private Hamilton was firing his last few rounds. The ammunition crisis was becoming acute. The fire from the soldiers began to slacken, not from a lack of will, but from a lack of resources. On the ridge, the bandits sensed the shift. The return fire was sporadic now. The sergeant was down. The flanking guard was wounded. The momentum had shifted definitively to the attackers. They began to stand up more freely, taking better aim. They fired with impunity, picking off the survivors who tried to move. Corporal Mays, realizing that his position was becoming a tomb, made a decision. He could not stay where he was. He had to get to the others. He began to crawl down the road toward the ambulance. He dragged his useless leg behind him, the raw flesh scraping over the rocks. It was a journey of 50 yards that felt like 50 miles. Every inch was a struggle against pain and gravity. Bullets kicked up dust around him, but the bandits seemed to be toying with him now, or perhaps they were focusing on the main group. Mays reached the rear of the ambulance. He pulled himself into the shadow of the tailgate. He looked for Brown. He saw the sergeant lying in the open. Mays wanted to help, but he had nothing to give. He checked his pockets for cartridges. He had 2 left. He loaded one into his carbine and saved the other. He would not be taken alive. The heroism of Brown and Mays was not a cinematic charge or a triumphant turning of the tide. It was a gritty, ugly, painful endurance. It was the refusal to stop doing one's duty when every instinct screamed to flee. It was the act of firing back when the air was solid with death. It was a specific type of courage born of discipline and loyalty to the uniform. They had stood in the fire, and the fire had consumed them. Major Wham looked at the sun. It was late afternoon. The shadows were long. The fight had lasted for nearly 2 hours. It was an eternity. He realized that they could not hold the road. If they stayed, they would all die and the money would be taken anyway. The only way to save the lives of the remaining men was to retreat to the creek bed, where the steep banks offered cover from the plunging fire. But retreating meant leaving the box. It meant leaving Brown and Mays, who could not walk. Wham agonized over the decision. Then Brown spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Go, sir. Get the men to the wash. Make a stand there." Brown was releasing them. He was accepting his fate to save the squad. Wham looked at the sergeant with tears cutting through the dust on his face. He nodded. He gave the order. "Fall back. To the creek. Move!" The able-bodied soldiers hesitated. They did not want to leave their wounded. "Take them," Wham ordered. "Drag them." Private Hamilton and Private Arrington grabbed Sergeant Brown by his tunic. They stayed low, dragging him across the sharp stones. Brown groaned, the pain tearing through him, but he did not cry out. They reached the edge of the road and slid him down the embankment into the soft sand of the wash. Other soldiers grabbed Young and the other wounded men. They tumbled down the slope, a chaotic avalanche of blue wool and blood. Corporal Mays, seeing the retreat, managed to roll himself over the edge of the road, falling 10 feet into the dry grass below. The impact jarred his wounded leg, sending him into a black void of unconsciousness for a moment. When he woke, he was in the wash. He was alive. The road was now empty of living soldiers. Only the dead mules and the wrecked wagons remained. The strongbox sat alone in the ambulance. The resistance on the road had ended. The battle of the road was over. The battle of the creek bed was about to begin. But the delay caused by Brown and Mays had cost the bandits time and ammunition. They had made the outlaws pay for every inch of ground. The bandits on the ridge saw the soldiers disappear over the edge. They held their fire. The silence that followed was sudden and shocking. The roaring of the guns was replaced by the groans of the wounded in the wash and the buzzing of flies. The air cleared slowly. The dust settled. The Medal of Honor was not won in a moment of glory. It was earned in the dirt with a bullet in the gut and a rifle in the hand. It was earned by Benjamin Brown standing up when he should have stayed down. It was earned by Isaiah Mays crawling when he should have waited for death. It was a testament to the fact that the human spirit could endure the unendurable, even when the outcome was a foregone disaster. The gold was lost, but the honor of the regiment had been preserved in the blood of its non-commissioned officers. The cessation of gunfire created a vacuum of silence in the canyon that was heavier than the noise of the battle. For the first time in 2 hours, the echoes of the shots faded, leaving only the localized sounds of the immediate aftermath. The groaning of the maimed mules, the settling of the wrecked wagons, and the heavy breathing of the men on the ridge. The road, once a thoroughfare of military authority, was now a debris field of wood, iron, flesh, and brass. The soldiers of the 24th Infantry and 10th Cavalry had vanished over the edge of the embankment into the creek bed, leaving the prize unguarded in the center of the kill zone. The tactical objective of the ambush had been achieved. The defenders were displaced. The path to the currency was open. Wilfred Webb stood up from behind the stone breastwork, his silhouette breaking the skyline for the first time without fear of reprisal. He scanned the road below, looking for any sign of movement among the wreckage. He saw only the stillness of inanimate objects and the twitching of the dying animals. He signaled to his men. It was time to descend. The transition from combatants to thieves began. The men did not rush down the slope in a chaotic mob. They moved with a wary deliberation, keeping their rifles trained on the lip of the ravine where the soldiers had disappeared. They knew the army regulars were not dead, merely suppressed, and a sudden resurgence of fire was a possibility they had to manage. The outlaws scrambled over the wall they had built, their boots sliding on the loose shale of the hillside. They navigated the steep 40-foot drop to the road surface, kicking up small avalanches of gravel that rattled down ahead of them. When their boots hit the hard-packed dirt of the road, the reality of the violence they had inflicted became tangible. The smell of the scene was overpowering. It was a mixture of wet iron from the blood, the pungent musk of the mules, the acrid bite of burnt gunpowder, and the dry, dusty heat of the Arizona afternoon. The heat radiating off the canyon walls felt intensified at the bottom of the wash, baking the carnage in the sun. Webb walked directly toward the ambulance. He stepped over the carcass of the lead mule, his boot brushing against the animal's stiffening flank. He approached the vehicle from the side, using the battered frame as cover against any potential shots from the wash. He peered into the cab. The driver's seat was shredded, the stuffing hanging out in clumps. He looked through the gap between the seats into the rear of the wagon. There, bolted to the floorboards, sat the object of their violence, the wooden strongbox. It was scarred by a few bullet impacts that had punched through the side of the wagon, but the structure appeared intact. The heavy iron padlock was still secured through the hasp. The rest of the gang converged on the wagons. They were a motley collection of men, their faces masked by sweat and grime, their clothes torn by the rocks. They moved with a nervous energy, the adrenaline of the fight shifting into the avarice of the looting. One of the Smith brothers walked over to the escort wagon to check for anything of value, but the focus was overwhelmingly on the ambulance. They crowded around the rear of the vehicle, their eyes fixed on the box. The silence was broken by the sound of their voices, harsh and loud in the quiet canyon. They shouted instructions to one another, ignoring the proximity of the soldiers in the wash below. "Get it open," one man demanded, slamming the butt of his rifle against the side of the wagon. "Break it." Webb examined the lock. It was a heavy-duty government-issue padlock, designed to withstand tampering. He tried to twist it with his bare hands, testing the strength of the hasp. It was solid. He looked around the road for a tool. His eyes landed on the felling axe that Private Hamilton had dropped near the boulder at the start of the fight. It was lying in the dust, the blade gleaming dully. Webb walked over and picked it up. The handle was warm from the sun. He hefted it, feeling the balance. It was a tool for clearing wood, now repurposed for clearing the final obstacle to the fortune. He returned to the ambulance. He climbed into the back of the wagon, his boots crunching on the broken glass and wood splinters that littered the floor. The space was cramped. He raised the axe, the head scraping the canvas roof of the ambulance. He brought it down with a grunt of exertion. The blade struck the wood of the strongbox next to the hasp. The wood splintered, a white gouge appearing in the oak. Webb swung again, and again. The sound of the axe striking the box echoed down into the wash, a rhythmic thudding that the soldiers below could hear clearly. It was the sound of their failure being finalized. After 6 heavy blows, the wood around the hasp gave way. The iron staple was torn free from the timber. Webb hooked the blade of the axe under the lid and pried it upward. The nails screeched as they were pulled from the wood. The lid flew back, banging against the side of the wagon. The interior of the box was revealed. Packed tightly inside were the canvas sacks, stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury. They were nondescript bags, dirty white in color, tied with simple twine. But the shape and the weight of them told the story. Webb reached in and grabbed the neck of the nearest sack. He tried to lift it with one hand. It was incredibly heavy. It was the gold. He pulled it out and tossed it to the men waiting on the ground. The sack hit the dirt with a solid metallic thud that did not bounce. "Gold," Webb said, his voice flat but loud. "It's the gold." The men on the ground pounced on the sack. One of them used a knife to slash the canvas. A stream of coins spilled out into the dust. They were $20 double eagles and $10 eagles, their surfaces catching the sunlight. The gold was bright, untarnished, and mesmerizing. For men who lived their lives counting pennies and dodging debts, the sight of raw specie in such quantity was intoxicating. They reached into the pile, scooping up handfuls of the coins. The metal was cool to the touch, a stark contrast to the burning air. The coins clinked against each other, a sound of pure wealth. Webb continued to empty the box. He threw sack after sack out of the wagon. There were 8 sacks of gold in total. Then came the silver. The silver dollars were packed in larger sacks, and they were significantly heavier by volume. Webb strained to lift them. He grunted, heaving them over the tailgate. The sacks of silver hit the ground with a heavier, duller sound. The pile of money grew in the middle of the road, a mound of canvas and metal sitting amidst the wreckage of the ambush. The looting process descended into a chaotic frenzy of division. The men did not wait to count it later. They wanted their share now. They began to stuff the sacks into their own saddlebags, which they had brought down from the ridge. They filled their pockets. They filled their hats. The gold was the priority. It was value condensed into density. A man could carry thousands of dollars in gold in his pockets. The silver was a logistical problem. $1,000 in silver weighed nearly 60 pounds. It was bulky and burdensome. One bandit, identified later as Marcus Cunningham, scooped up a handful of gold coins and let them fall back into the sack, laughing manically. "We're rich," he shouted. "We're goddamn kings." He stuffed the coins into the front of his shirt, the weight of them pulling the fabric down. He looked like a man gorging himself at a feast. The distribution was not equal or orderly. It was a grab. Men shoved each other to get at the open sacks. "Back off," one shouted. "There's enough for everyone." But the panic of the moment, the fear that the soldiers might return or that the law would arrive, drove them to grab as much as they could, as fast as they could. They were stealing not just from the army, but potentially from each other in the confusion. Webb climbed down from the wagon. He took charge of the scene. "Leave the silver if you can't carry it," he ordered. "Take the gold. Get the gold." He kicked a sack of silver dollars. It was too heavy to run with. He grabbed a sack of gold and tied it to his belt. The weight pulled at his waist, but it was a welcome burden. The outlaws began to strip the scene of other valuables. They walked over to where the soldiers had dropped gear during the fight. They picked up a few of the abandoned Springfield rifles, examining them. One bandit worked the action of a rifle, ejected a cartridge, and then threw the weapon into the ravine. They didn't want the heavy muskets. They wanted to disarm the enemy further. They took cartridge belts found on the ground. They took a telescope that Major Wham had left in the ambulance. They took the Major's personal kit bag. As they looted, they kept a wary eye on the creek bed. They could hear the soldiers moving in the brush down below. The sounds of men in pain, the snapping of twigs. The bandits felt a surge of dominance. They yelled insults down into the wash. "Come up and get your pay, soldiers," one shouted. "It's payday." They mocked the wounded. They taunted Major Wham by name. "Wham, you hear us, Wham, we're taking it all." The desecration of the convoy was systematic. They cut the harnesses of the surviving mules to ensure no pursuit could be mounted with the wagons. They smashed the spokes of the ambulance wheels with the axe. They wanted to leave the army stranded in the desert. It was a vindictive destruction, born of the adrenaline of the firefight. They had been shot at, and now they were taking their revenge on the equipment. One of the bandits found a crate of tobacco in the escort wagon. He broke it open and grabbed handfuls of the plugs, stuffing them into his pockets alongside the gold coins. Another found the soldiers' rations. He took a tin of beef, looked at it, and threw it at the dead mule. They didn't want food. They had money to buy the best steaks in the territory now. The physical sensation of the theft was gritty and laborious. The sacks of money were coated in the dust of the road. The men's hands were black with dirt and grease. The sweat ran down their faces, stinging their eyes. They were breathing hard from the exertion of carrying the heavy metal. The romantic image of the outlaw was stripped away, replaced by the reality of sweating laborers hauling stolen goods in the heat. Webb checked his pocket watch. They had been on the road for 15 minutes. It was time to go. "Mount up," he ordered. "Let's move." The men began to retreat toward the ridge where their horses were tied on the reverse slope. They carried the sacks of gold over their shoulders like grain. Some of the silver was left behind, spilled on the road or in sacks that were too heavy to lift. The road was littered with silver dollars, gleaming white against the dirt, trampled into the mud by the boots of the robbers. As they climbed back up the steep slope, the weight of the loot slowed them down. They slipped and scrambled, clutching the bags. A few coins spilled from a torn sack, rolling down the hill back toward the road. The bandits didn't stop to retrieve them. They kept climbing. They reached the top of the ridge and disappeared over the crest. Back on the road, the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of emptiness. The strongbox lay open and violated in the back of the ambulance, its lid hanging by one hinge. The floor of the wagon was bare. The road was strewn with the debris of the theft, the broken lock, the torn canvas, the scattered silver coins, the axe. The soldiers in the wash listened to the sounds of the departure. They heard the scramble on the rocks, the fading voices, and then the sound of hooves riding. Away to the south, they waited. Major Wham held his hand up, keeping his men down. He needed to be sure they were gone. He didn't want to walk into a rearguard trap. He counted the minutes. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The canyon remained quiet. The looting had been absolute. Of the $28,345.10, the bandits had managed to carry away nearly all of the gold and a significant portion of the silver. The precise amount taken was later calculated to be $28,345.10, leaving only a scattered residue of coins behind. It was one of the most successful cash robberies in the history of the frontier. The sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, casting long shadows across the scene. The light turned a deep, bruised purple. The flies began to settle in thick clouds on the dead mules and the pools of blood. The smell of death grew stronger as the heat persisted. The road at Cottonwood Wash had been transformed from a battlefield into a crime scene. The evidence of the act was written in the physical displacement of the government's property. The ownership of the wealth had been transferred by force. The gold that had been minted in San Francisco and Philadelphia, stamped with the authority of the federal government, was now in the pockets of men who recognized no authority but the gun. The visual of the open box was the defining image of the defeat. It was a gaping maw, empty and dark. It symbolized the total failure of the Escort mission. The men had fought, they had bled, and they had failed. The box was empty. The mission was a zero. The scattered silver dollars on the road looked like stars in the dirt. They were the crumbs left by the gluttons. A few lay in the blood of the mules. A few were half buried in the tire tracks of the wagon. They were the only money left for the garrison at Fort Thomas. The outlaws had not just taken the money, they had taken the pride of the 24th Infantry. They had walked onto a government road, suppressed a military unit, smashed a government lock, and walked away with a government fortune. It was a humiliation that would sting more than the bullet wounds. As the last bandit disappeared into the wilderness, the event of the robbery concluded. The narrative of the fight was over. The narrative of the survival and the legal aftermath was about to begin. But for the moment, the canyon belonged to the flies and the silver dollars. The money was gone. The canyon floor at Cottonwood Wash, which had recently reverberated with the mechanical roar of gunfire, was now dominated by the heavy, suffocating silence of the aftermath. The sun, suspended low in the western sky, cast the wash in a stark relief of long shadows and blinding highlights, illuminating the defeat of the 24th Infantry. Down in the dry creek bed where the survivors had taken shelter, the reality of their condition began to supersede the adrenaline of the combat. It was late afternoon on May 11, 1889, and the soldiers were no longer fighting for the payroll. They were fighting to stabilize the catastrophic damage inflicted upon their own bodies. The bandits had departed, their hoofbeats fading into the southern wilderness, leaving behind a group of men who were battered, bleeding, and stranded in a hostile environment without transport or water. Major Joseph Wham knelt in the sand beside Sergeant Benjamin Brown. The sergeant was conscious but fading, his skin the color of wet ash under the layer of dust. The abdominal wound he had sustained was grievous, a dark pulsing aperture in his tunic where the .45 caliber slug had entered. Beside it, his arm lay at an unnatural angle, the bone shattered by the second bullet. Wham used his pocket knife to cut away the fabric of Brown's uniform, exposing the damage. The sight was clinical and grim. There was no surgeon, no antiseptic, and no morphine. Wham took a relatively clean handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it into the stomach wound, applying direct pressure. Brown groaned, his teeth clenched, a sound of raw animal pain that seemed too loud in the quiet wash. The other soldiers were scattered around them in the brush, tending to their own injuries. Private James Young sat with his back against a driftwood log, staring at his thigh. The tourniquet they had improvised from a rifle sling was holding, but the leg was swollen and purple below the constriction. Private Hamilton, who had escaped major injury, moved among the men, checking for water. He shook the canteens that had been carried down during the retreat. Most were empty, drained during the fight, or punctured by bullets. He found one canteen with a pint of tepid water remaining. He brought it to the major. Wham took the vessel and carefully poured a small amount into the cap, lifting it to Brown's cracked lips. The sergeant swallowed with difficulty, the water running down his chin, mixing with the blood. Corporal Isaiah Mays lay a few yards away, his wounded leg elevated on a rock. He was examining the exit wound where the bullet had passed through his calf. The flesh was ragged, but the bleeding had slowed to a steady ooze. Mays was a cavalryman, accustomed to the injuries of livestock, and he viewed his own leg with a detached pragmatism. He knew that if infection set in, the leg would be lost. He took a handful of the dry, sandy soil from the creek bed and packed it around the wound, a desperate frontier remedy to clot the blood, hoping the scorched earth was sterile enough not to kill him. The heat remained oppressive. The canyon walls trapped the solar radiation, creating a kiln-like effect even as the sun began to descend. The air was still, heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sulfurous residue of the black powder smoke that drifted down from the road. The flies had arrived. They buzzed in thick clouds around the wounded men, settling on the open sores and the sweat-soaked uniforms. Private Arrington swatted at them listlessly, too exhausted to keep them at bay. The insects were a torment, a reminder that in nature they were merely biomass to be consumed. Wham knew they could not stay in the wash. The creek bed was a trap. If the bandits returned, or if a flash flood occurred from rain in the mountains, they would be helpless. More importantly, they needed help. Fort Thomas was still miles to the north, and Fort Grant was miles to the south. They were in the dead center of the wilderness. He stood up, his knees cracking. He looked at the able-bodied men, Hamilton, Arrington, and the civilian clerk Gibbon, who was huddled in a ball, shaking from shock. "We have to move," Wham said, his voice raspy from thirst. "We have to get back to the road." The ascent back up to the ambush site was a physical ordeal that rivaled the battle itself. The bank was steep, composed of loose gravel and dirt that crumbled underfoot. The uninjured men had to carry the wounded. Hamilton and Arrington lifted Sergeant Brown. Brown screamed once as they moved him, his body rigid with agony before he passed out from the pain. It was a mercy. They dragged him up the slope, his boots leaving twin furrows in the sand. Wham helped Young, allowing the private to lean his entire weight on the major's shoulder as they hopped and scrambled up the incline. Mays crawled on his hands and one good knee, refusing help until he reached the final lip of the road where the others pulled him over. When the group finally stood on the hard-packed surface of the road, the full scale of the devastation was revealed to them. It was a scene of total material failure. The ambulance sat listing to one side, its wheels smashed, the spokes protruding like broken ribs. The canvas top was shredded, flapping gently in the slight breeze. The escort wagon was a splintered wreck, its contents spilled and trampled into the dirt. But the most arresting sight was the carnage of the animals. The mules lay in tangles of leather and limb, their bodies already bloating in the heat. The smell was overpowering, a thick, sweet stench of death that made the men gag. Wham walked to the rear of the ambulance. He needed to see it for himself. He looked into the open back of the wagon. The strongbox was there, the lid ripped off, the interior void. The wood around the hasp was hacked and gouged. The emptiness of the box was absolute. $28,345.10 in gold and silver. The pay for the regiment, the sustenance for hundreds of families, was gone. All that remained were a few stray silver dollars scattered on the floorboards and in the dirt of the road, shining mockingly in the dust. Wham stared at the coins. He did not pick them up. They were trash now, the refuse of the robbery. Clerk Gibbon stood beside the major, staring at the empty box. He began to weep, not from physical pain, but from the crushing weight of the administrative disaster. He was responsible for the ledger, and now the ledger was meaningless. "They took it all," he whispered. "Every cent." Wham turned away from the box. "Forget the money," he ordered. "Check the wagons for water. Check for ammunition. We are not dead yet. The soldiers searched the wreckage. The looting had been thorough but hasty. The bandits had taken the gold and the guns, but they had ignored some of the baser supplies. Private Hamilton found a canteen trapped under the seat of the escort wagon. It was half full. He held it up like a trophy. They found a few tins of corned beef that had been kicked under the wagon. They found a scattered pile of cartridges that had spilled from a broken crate. They gathered these meager resources. The water was rationed immediately, a single mouthful for each man, with a double ration for the wounded. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The light was failing. They had to decide on a course of action. They could not stay on the road with the dead mules. The coyotes and wolves would come soon. They needed to reach a defensible position, or better yet, a habitation. Wham consulted his mental map of the territory. The nearest water and potential aid was a ranch located several miles away, near the Cedar Springs stage station. It was a significant distance for healthy men. For this group, it was a marathon. "We walk," Wham stated. "We carry who we can. We help the others hobble. We leave everything else." They prepared for the march. They stripped the harness leather from the dead mules to make slings for the rifles and supports for the wounded. They used the splintered wood from the wagon sideboards to fashion crude crutches for Young and Mays. The process was slow and painful. Every movement required effort from muscles that were already trembling with exhaustion. They prioritized the weapons. They would not walk unarmed. They gathered every rifle they could find, even the ones with shattered stocks. They loaded every weapon with the scavenged ammunition. If the bandits returned to finish the job, the 24th would make them pay again. The procession began to move north along the road. It was a slow, agonizing column. Major Wham walked at the front, scouting the path, his revolver drawn. Behind him, Hamilton and Arrington carried Sergeant Brown on a makeshift litter made from 2 rifles and a blanket. Brown was conscious again, staring up at the darkening sky, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Private Young hobbled on his crutch, gritting his teeth with every step, his face a mask of sweat and dust. Corporal Mays dragged his leg, using a long piece of wagon siding as a cane, his progress a rhythmic shuffle and thump. The road was rough, littered with rocks that twisted ankles and jarred injuries. The temperature began to drop as the sun vanished, but the ground retained the day's heat, radiating it upward into their souls. The silence of the march was broken only by the sound of boots on stone and the occasional groan. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The mission was a failure. The only objective now was survival. They walked for an hour. The distance covered was perhaps 2 miles. It felt like 20. The darkness became complete save for the starlight and a sliver of moon. The shadows of the cactus and the mesquite bushes loomed on the sides of the road, transforming into phantom bandits in the peripheral vision of the soldiers. Every rustle of a lizard in the brush caused hands to tighten on rifle stocks. The psychological strain of the ambush had left them jumpy and paranoid. Private Young stumbled and fell, landing hard on his injured leg. He cried out, a sharp, piercing sound. Wham called a halt. They waited while Young gathered the strength to stand. Hamilton offered him a hand. Young took it, pulling himself up, tears streaming down his face. "I can make it," he gasped. "I can make it." He forced himself to take another step. The determination of the men was the only fuel they had left. Wham dropped back to check on Brown. The sergeant was feverish. His skin was hot to the touch. The infection from the gut wound would be setting in soon if it hadn't already. Wham whispered encouragement. "Stay with us, Sergeant. Just a little further." Brown nodded slightly, his eyes unfocused. He mumbled something about the formation, his mind drifting back to the drill field. They passed the 3-mile mark. The thirst returned sharper than before. The single mouthful of water had evaporated from their systems hours ago. Their tongues felt swollen in their mouths. Their throats were like sandpaper. The thought of water became a fixation. They dreamed of the pump at Fort Grant, of the cool overflow splashing on the ground. The reality was the dry dust of the road. Ahead in the darkness, Wham saw a shape. It was a building, a low adobe structure. It was the ranch near Cedar Springs. A wave of relief washed over him, so profound it nearly made his knees buckle. "Structure ahead," he announced. The pace of the column quickened perceptibly. The promise of water and rest drew them forward. They approached the building with caution. Wham did not assume it was friendly. He hailed the house from the road. "Hello, the house. United States Army, we have wounded." A light appeared in a window. A door opened. A man stepped out holding a lantern and a shotgun. "Who's there?" "Major Wham, paymaster. We've been robbed. We need water." The rancher lowered the shotgun. He saw the ragged group emerging from the gloom, the bloodied uniforms, the litter, the limping men. He rushed forward. "My God," he said, "what happened to you?" "Ambush," Wham said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "At the wash." The rancher shouted for his family. They brought water immediately. The soldiers drank greedily, the water spilling down their chins. It was the sweetest substance they had ever tasted. They were ushered into the main room of the ranch house. The rancher's wife began tearing up sheets for bandages. They laid Brown and the other seriously wounded men on the floor. The immediate crisis of exposure was over. They had walls around them. They had water. Wham sat on a wooden chair, his body finally sagging under the weight of the day. He accepted a cup of coffee. His hands shook so badly the liquid rippled in the cup. He took a sip. The warmth spread through his chest. He looked at his men. They were alive, battered, defeated, and empty-handed, but alive. He asked the rancher for paper and a pen. He needed to write the report. He needed to document the disaster while the details were fresh. The rancher provided a piece of stationery and a pencil. Wham placed the paper on the table. He stared at the blank white sheet. How to describe the chaos? How to explain the loss of $28,345.10? He began to write. "To the Assistant Adjutant General, Department of Arizona, Sir, I have the honor to report." The pencil scratched across the paper. He detailed the attack, the rock in the road, the volley from the ridge, the defense, the retreat. He listed the wounded. Sergeant Brown, Corporal Mays, Private Young. He listed the loss, the box broken open, the contents taken. As he wrote, the adrenaline finally faded completely, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He felt the bruises on his own body, the scrapes he hadn't noticed. He looked at his boots covered in the dust of the road and the blood of his sergeant. He felt a deep, burning anger. Not at his men. They had fought like lions. But at the situation, at the bandits, at the geography itself. The soldiers slept where they fell on the floor. Their snoring was loud, the sleep of the dead. Wham finished the report. He folded the paper. He would send a rider to Fort Thomas in the morning. The telegraph wires would hum with the news. The army would be mobilized. The hunt would begin. But for tonight, the story was one of survival. They had walked out of the slaughterhouse. They had carried their brothers. They had refused to die in the ditch. The long walk back was over. The physical journey had ended, but the psychological journey was just beginning. The memory of the empty box and the sound of the axe striking wood would haunt them. Wham stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. Somewhere out there, 12 men were dividing $28,345.10. They were celebrating. Wham touched the glass. "Enjoy it," he whispered. "We will find you." The ranch clock chimed midnight. May 11th became May 12th. The day of the robbery passed into history. The events of the canyon were now facts to be disputed in courtrooms and debated in barracks. But the truth of the violence was written on the bodies of the men sleeping on the floor. Sergeant Brown shifted in his sleep, crying out softly. Wham went to him, checking the bandage. The bleeding had stopped for now. The sergeant was tough. He would live. And because he would live, the story would be told. The testimony of these men would be the only weapon they had left to reclaim their honor. Major Wham blew out the lantern. The room plunged into darkness. He sat back in the chair, closing his eyes, waiting for the dawn that would bring the marshals, the doctors, and the questions. The escort mission was officially terminated. The recovery mission had begun. The investigative phase that followed the violence at Cottonwood Wash was characterized by a collision between federal authority and territorial solidarity. In the months following the robbery, United States Marshal William Meade and his deputies executed a series of raids and arrests throughout the Gila Valley, sweeping up the men identified by the surviving soldiers. By the late autumn of 1889, the accumulated evidence pointed directly at Gilbert Webb, his brothers, and their associates. The marshals found physical traces of the crime, including new clothes and equipment purchased with gold coins that matched the stolen mint dates, but the hard currency itself remained elusive, hidden in caches deep within the desert or laundered through sympathetic local economies. The suspects were transported to Tucson, the seat of the federal court for the territory, and confined within the Pima County Jail to await a trial that would test the integrity of the judicial system in the Arizona Territory. The legal proceedings began in full earnest as the calendar turned to 1890. The city of Tucson was a blend of adobe tradition and encroaching Victorian brick, a dusty metropolis that served as the political center of the region. The trial was held in the federal courthouse, a building that became the focal point of public attention. The atmosphere surrounding the case was charged with a palpable tension that transcended the simple facts of a robbery. It was a confrontation between the United States Army, represented by the African American soldiers of the 24th Infantry, and the local settler population, many of whom viewed the federal government as an intrusive, oppressive force. The jury pool was drawn from this local population, a demographic reality that the prosecution viewed with extreme skepticism, but was powerless to change under the existing laws of venue. Judge Richard Sloan presided over the court. He was a man of the law, appointed by the federal government, and he sought to maintain order in a courtroom that was often filled to capacity with spectators who openly favored the defense. The prosecution was led by United States Attorney Harry Jeffords, who built his case on the eyewitness testimony of the men who had been in the kill zone. Jeffords understood that without the recovered money, the identification of the shooters by Major Wham and his escort was the linchpin of the entire effort to secure a conviction. He called the soldiers to the stand one by one, a procession of men bearing the physical scars of the engagement. Major Joseph Wham was the first major witness. He took the stand in his dress uniform, his demeanor rigid and professional. He recounted the events of May 11th with precise military terminology, describing the placement of the boulder, the initial volley, and the subsequent looting. He pointed to the defendants sitting at the counsel table: Gilbert Webb, Lyman Follett, Marcus Cunningham, and the others. Wham identified them not with hesitation, but with the certainty of a man who had looked them in the eye while under fire. He described the specific commands Webb had given during the looting and the axe used to smash the strongbox. The defense attorneys, a well-funded team hired by the families of the accused, attacked Wham's testimony by questioning his vantage point in the chaos of the battle, suggesting that the smoke and fear had clouded his judgment. Wham remained unshaken, insisting that the sun was high and the visibility was clear. Sergeant Benjamin Brown was called next. His appearance in the courtroom created a silence in the gallery. He walked with a noticeable limp and held his arm stiffly, the result of the shattered bone that had not healed perfectly. The sheer physical presence of the sergeant, a black man standing as a figure of authority and accusation against white defendants in a territorial court, was a radical disruption of the social order of 1890. Brown testified with a quiet intensity. He described the faces of the men who had shot him. He pointed a finger at the man who had stood on the ridge and aimed a rifle at his chest. The defense cross-examined him aggressively, focusing on the distance and the angle of the sun, trying to inject reasonable doubt into the minds of the jurors. Brown answered simply that a man does not forget the face of the person trying to kill him. Corporal Isaiah Mays followed. He hobbled to the witness chair, his leg still causing him significant pain. Mays provided corroborating details regarding the flanking maneuver and the specific weapons used by the outlaws. He described the Smith brothers and their positioning on the northern end of the ridge. The prosecution introduced the medical reports of the soldiers' injuries as evidence of the intent to kill. These were not warning shots, they were center mass impacts designed to terminate life. The blood-stained tunics and the battered equipment of the convoy were displayed, bringing the violence of the canyon into the sterile environment of the courtroom. The defense case did not rely on disproving the robbery happened, but rather on proving that their clients were nowhere near Cottonwood Wash when it occurred. They launched a massive, coordinated alibi defense that relied on the testimony of dozens of community members from the Gila Valley. Witnesses took the stand to swear under oath that they had seen Gilbert Webb at a family gathering, or that they had been working cattle with the Follett brothers at the precise time of the ambush. This was a wall of communal perjury, a collective decision by the local population to protect their own against the federal outsiders. The prosecution argued that these alibis were fabricated, pointing out inconsistencies in the times and the impossibility of so many men remembering the exact minute of a day months in the past. However, the sheer volume of witnesses created a fog of conflicting narratives. The trial dragged on for weeks, becoming a spectacle of endurance for the jurors. The heat in the courtroom was stifling, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. The jurors, 12 white men from the territory, sat in the jury box listening to the conflicting stories. They looked at the soldiers, men of a different race who represented the federal occupation, and they looked at the defendants, men who were their neighbors, their kin, or their political allies. The racial and political undercurrents were not spoken aloud in the official record, but they dictated the emotional climate of the deliberation. The defense attorneys played to this, subtly framing the prosecution as a persecution of honest pioneers by a heavy-handed government. In the closing arguments, United States Attorney Jeffords made a passionate plea for the rule of law. He reminded the jury that a federal payroll had been hijacked, and United States soldiers had been maimed. He argued that to acquit these men in the face of positive identification by the victims would be to declare open season on the government. He pointed to the lack of any other plausible suspects and the sudden, unexplained wealth of the defendants immediately following the robbery. He asked the jury to look past the local loyalties and do their duty as citizens. The defense closed by reiterating the alibis. They painted the soldiers as mistaken, confused by the heat of battle, or perhaps vindictive. They argued that the prosecution had failed to produce the money, the smoking gun that would irrefutably link the men to the crime. Without the gold, they argued, there was only one word against another, and they had more words on their side. They appealed to the jury's sense of skepticism regarding federal power. Judge Sloan gave the jury their instructions. He explained the legal standard of reasonable doubt. He instructed them to weigh the credibility of the witnesses. The jury retired to deliberate. The waiting began. Major Wham and his men waited in the hallway or outside the courthouse, pacing the corridors. They felt the weight of the hostility directed at them by the crowds gathered outside. They knew that the evidence was overwhelming in a logical sense, but logic was not the only force at work in Tucson. After a deliberation that many considered perfunctory given the length of the trial, the jury returned. The foreman stood up to read the verdicts. The courtroom was silent. One by one, the names of the defendants were read, followed by the finding. Gilbert Webb, not guilty. Lyman Follett, not guilty. Marcus Cunningham, not guilty. The pattern repeated down the line. The jury acquitted the primary defendants of the robbery charges. A few minor figures faced lesser charges or hung juries on specific counts, but the ringleaders, the men who had stood on the ridge and pulled the triggers, were cleared of the federal crimes. The verdict was greeted. The verdict was, with cheers from the defense side of the courtroom and the spectators. The defendants shook hands with their lawyers, smiling with the relief of men who had gambled with their lives and won. Major Wham sat stone-faced, watching the celebration of the men who had shot his troops. The injustice was a physical blow, sharper than the exhaustion of the march. The soldiers of the 24th Infantry, who had stood their ground against a superior force and testified with honor, were told by the jury that their word was worth less than the alibis of the Outlaws' kin. The acquittal did not mean the end of the legal trouble for everyone, as some civil suits and minor charges lingered, but the great federal robbery case had collapsed. The government had failed to secure a conviction for one of the most brazen attacks on its sovereignty in the decade. The $28,345.10 remained missing, absorbed into the economy of the territory, used to buy ranches, cattle, and silence. The verdict sent a message that the Gila Valley was a place where federal writs ran only as far as a rifle bullet could travel. However, while the civilian court had failed to deliver justice, the United States Army sought to recognize the valor of the men who had fought. The recommendations for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the nation, had been submitted up the chain of command. The bureaucracy of the War Department moved slowly, but it moved with a different set of values than the Tucson jury. The accounts of the battle, detailed in Wham's reports and verified by the investigation, painted a picture of extraordinary courage under fire. On February 19, 1890, the War Department officially issued the Medal of Honor to Sergeant Benjamin Brown and Corporal Isaiah Mays. The citations were brief but powerful. Sergeant Brown's citation read, "Although shot in the abdomen in a fight between a paymaster's escort and robbers, did not leave the field until again wounded through both arms." It was a formal acknowledgement of his refusal to yield command while bleeding out in the dirt. Corporal May's citation noted his gallantry in the fight and his crawl to the ambulance. The presentation of these medals occurred later, in formal ceremonies at their respective posts. For Benjamin Brown, standing in formation to receive the medal was a vindication of his professional life. He wore the star on his uniform, a symbol that the United States government, if not the people of Arizona, recognized his sacrifice. The medal did not bring back the use of his arm, nor did it erase the pain of the wounds that would plague him for the rest of his life. But it cemented his status as a hero of the regiment. Corporal Mays likewise received his medal, a testament to the cavalrymen who held the flank alone. Other members of the escort were also recognized. Certificates of merit were awarded to Privates James, Young, Thornton, Hamilton, and several others for their conduct during the ambush. The Army closed ranks around its own, honoring the men who had done their duty when the civil society around them had failed to support them. The aftermath of the trial saw the dispersal of the actors. Major Wham continued his service as a paymaster, though the shadow of the robbery followed his career. He remained a stickler for regulations, perhaps even more so, driven by the memory of the empty box. The Buffalo soldiers of the 24th Infantry and 10th Cavalry continued their service on the frontier, patrolling the vast hostile spaces of the West, protecting the very settlements that had produced the jury that acquitted their attackers. They did so with the stoicism that defined their service. The outlaws returned to their lives in the Gila Valley. Gilbert Webb and the others walked free, but they carried the mark of the event. The community knew who had done it. The sudden prosperity of certain families was an open secret. Over time, the money was spent, the ranches were bought and sold, and the men grew old. The specific details of the robbery faded into local folklore, often romanticized by those who wanted to see the bandits as Robin Hood figures resisting the federal government, ignoring the reality of the violence inflicted on the soldiers. By 1891, the legal avenues were exhausted. The case was closed. The Department of Justice declined to pursue further charges, citing the impossibility of securing a conviction in the territory. The Wham paymaster robbery passed from a current event into history. It stood as a stark example of the lawlessness of the frontier, not just in the act of the robbery, but in the failure of the judicial system to address it. It highlighted the deep fissures in the society of the Southwest, political, racial, and regional. The site of the ambush, the ridge at Cottonwood Wash, remained unchanged. The rock breastworks built by the bandits stood for years, slowly eroding under the wind and rain, a silent monument to the day the canyon turned into a slaughter. The road was repaired, the ruts filled in, and traffic resumed. New wagons rolled over the ground where the mules had died and the silver dollars had been scattered. The blood was washed away by the monsoon rains, soaking into the earth. For the soldiers who survived, the memory was not of the political outcome, but of the sensory reality of May 11th. It was the sound of the axe hitting the wood, the smell of the powder smoke, the heat of the sun, and the voice of Sergeant Brown holding the line. The story of the Wham paymaster robbery was ultimately not about the money that was lost, but about the men who stood in the road and fought for it. It was a narrative of duty performed in the face of overwhelming odds, a gritty, violent chapter in the history of the American West that ended not with a judge's gavel but with the quiet dignity of a medal.